Mongol dog! Cut them down!
Well, welcome back to welcome back to another year of 31 for 31. If you don't know what this is, basically what this is 31 movies in 31 days, or 31 movie reviews in 31. I didn't watch these movies in 31 days. Took longer. Don't mind me. I'm still getting over being pretty sick. But it's December of 2022, and we're doing 31 for 31 again. So last year I did 31 for 31. The idea is to do 31 movie reviews in 31 days, 31 movies in 31 days out of my collection. If you're anything like me, which God, I hope you're not, you buy a lot of movies that you probably don't get around to watching. And so they go on the shelves, they go in your collection, whatever, to never be watched again, right? So the idea of this series is to get those movies and watch those movies finally and talk about them. So this year, one of the ways I picked the list of the movies is RNG. I went through my shelves, found all the movies that I haven't watched yet or haven't watched that aren't going to be in a video later down the road, put them into a list, RNG'd, and then this is our list for this year. Now, I will say that I kind of reorganized a few things so they flowed a little better. Like, we're starting this year off with Ron. We're ending also with something. But everything on this list, though, was picked from the RNG. Everything else besides 3 titles, yeah, just 3 titles, are even in the same slot that they were RNG'd into. I hope you'll enjoy this year's a lot of movies. I think it picked some really cool titles, so I'm pretty excited to talk about them. Enjoy. I figured since we ended last year's 31 for 31 with Ikiru Kurosawa, it only seemed fitting to open up this year with Ikiru Kurosawa. 1985's Ron was gifted to me last year for Christmas from a close friend in this beautiful 4K steelbook. But I gotta be honest, when it comes time to finding like 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 40 minutes to watch a samurai epic that I know my wife is not gonna have much interest in, it becomes a little hard to find that time. Thus, Ron has sit dormant on my shelf for the better part of this past year. Ron being one of the last in Ikiru Kurosawa's career and his last samurai epic, it really feels like one last huzzah, as this film is a masterclass in scale. The film follows Hidetora Ichimonji, an aging warlord who retires by handing his empire over to his 3 sons, giving the main castle to his oldest son and leaving the other 2 castles to his other sons, while he's wanting to stay in power as a great lord. When Saburo, I'm assuming his youngest son, it never really says, but considering how Hidetora handed out the castles and how Kurosawa positions the brothers during the scene, I'm just gonna make the assumption. But when Saburo talks very bluntly to his father about this being a bad idea, Hidetora banishes him, leaving just his 2 sons. Taro, his eldest, and Jiro, the assumed middle child, to lead his empire, with Taro being the overall lord. Once Taro is in charge, he marries Lady Kaide, who convinces Taro to take full control over his father, especially when those loyal to Hidetora clashes with Taro's followers. Once banished from the empire, Hidetora, along with those who still follow him, wander the lands as more conniving takes place, which leads to an all-out war. This might be one of Kurosawa's most brutal films, as there's some truly horrific battles and some surprisingly gruesome gore as well. His patience to just let you linger on these brutal moments felt raw compared to other Kurosawa's films that don't show you as much of the aftermaths of the war, but considering the film's story is cause and effect of bloodshed, especially that was shed during Hidetora's rise to power, it's fitting as it builds to Hidetora's mental deterioration that you see during the course of the film, as he is haunted by his past actions and even punished for them in a way. His actions ripple throughout his bloodline like a plague once Hidetora tries to pass off control, letting go the chaos into hands he can no longer manage. While yes, there's marvelous action set pieces that I will talk about here in a minute, this is foremost a story of regret, a human story of remorse and grief, a story of vengeance and wrath. There's a lot of elements here that's apparently an adaptation of Shakespeare's King Lear, which I know nothing about. Hidetora is a fascinating character with a deep history who has influenced the entire world around him, rather it be good or bad. You watch this man go from being a well-respected and feared leader to a groveling, mentally unstable man who becomes a ghost of himself, even losing his skin tone, becoming a frail, pale imitation of himself. You see those affected by him either watch with pity as he falls apart, or watch them struggle to strive to power that he left vacant. Or you watch them in his weakened state try to pray for their own revenge on the violence he left in their wake in the past. Every character is clearly defined and is established in their motives, and each actor brings a great performance to cement their characters in this story. The production of this movie might be the most mind-blowing thing about it though. From massively large sets to costume design that it won an Oscar for, it's a super impressive production. During these large-scale action set pieces, there's a ton of live horses with a million extras, all sporting great-looking armor sets or beautifully designed garbs that makes it a spectacle to see covered in blood. There's a scene where a man gets killed and all these horses just barely skate by him, and it's done in one take, where I literally said, wow, I'm surprised he didn't get kicked or crushed. There's a lot of moments like this where it's filmed in these long wide shots where arrows are just flying by people, where it feels kind of dangerous for the performers, but it helps sell the danger of the set pieces. Just to see so large of a scale of conflict with real bodies dressed to the nines choreographed is just stunning. There's these moments where in large groups of horseback riders a horse would trip with the rider on board that seemed unintentional but added to the scene, where I really hoped nobody including the animals were hurt in the process of making this film. The scene where Hiruko walks out of the burning castle is one of the most stunning scenes I've ever seen in my life, as they actually burnt the castle to the ground. The cinematography in this film is just amazing, as it is in pretty much every Kurosawa film I've seen, being set in color compared to a lot of the black and white scenes I'm used to with Kurosawa. It adds to the film's tone as these colorful costumes and saturated film stock intensifies its atmosphere. Kurosawa allowing his framing to breathe in these long still shots, but also at times allowing the camera to move within these uninterrupted shots, crafts some beautiful composition and some picturesque moments. There are some moments where this lingering in Hiruto's mental state, where we just follow him wandering around, maybe lingers too long, as some of those moments tend to drag on. That feels like a hindrance to an otherwise rather quick pacing, considering how much is going on. There's so much compelling drama and captivating action that there's not very many moments that feel like they drag, but there was a couple of times I thought to myself where I wish we would move on to the next scene, where the wandering or babbling didn't seem to add much extra to what was already presented. There's also a scene towards the end where a large army is gathering and a group of horseback riders come in and someone drops their sword. It seemed like a mistake, but I found it to be pretty humorous. Musically, the film is fine. Music seemed fitting for both the tone and the period, but never stood out as anything memorable. Overall though, Ran is a great way to start off this year's 31 for 31, as it should be a staple in anybody's catalog of Japanese cinema and samurai epics. It's definitely moved itself into being one of my favorite by Kurosawa, and one I'll definitely be watching again whenever I find time to do so. I strongly recommend checking this one out, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. Wolvesbayne, released by SP Releasing and Echo Bridge, a company that fills the Dollar Tree shelves, is the only movie I found at the Dollar Tree in a steelbook. Of course, with its artwork and the fact that it's a werewolf movie in a steelbook at the Dollar Tree before it became the $1.25 tree, I had to grab it. And you know what? I haven't even opened this one, so cut to unboxing. So I haven't even opened this one yet. I've not even taken the plastic off, so we'll have a little unboxing video here. I just run a screwdriver up it to see what's inside, shall we? Bloop. So normally these things have a little back protector, but this one's actually printed on the back, which is kind of cool. It's steelbook. I'll let you guys see the cross. I mean, kind of cool. This is a movie that's been festering on my shelves since all the steelbooks or collector's editions get shelf space regardless, but I have to say, after a quick glance at IMDb and that rating, it's never become a priority for me. Of course, doing a random number generator would pick it to be the second film and a follow-up to Ran, which is pretty funny. Before I talk about this film, have you ever heard of the term sci-fi original used to describe a film? At least in my circle, there's a term we use to define a certain type of film. Growing up with the Sci-Fi Channel or SIFI now, used to make a lot of low-budget, schlocky horror and sci-fi films that was riddled with bad acting, terrible effects, poor writing, and overall just cheap production. It was a standard for the channel, as rarely rememberable movies could break that mold, thus coining the term sci-fi original, used to describe movies in the same ilk that may or may not be a sci-fi original movie. This term completely applies to Wolvesbayne. After Lilith, a powerful vampire, is vanquished, a coven wants to bring her back to the world by collecting amulets, all while Russell Bane, the Bane of Wolvesbayne,
wow, Felix was right. You are gorgeous.
is trying to buy out Alex's occult store for capitalist reasons. One night driving home, he is stopped by a young woman who believes she hit a person and her car won't start. After driving away, he sees her being attacked by a werewolf and of course thinks he can help, so he jumps in and gets attacked too. Waking up in a hospital, he finds he has some new senses, and Alex helps him become the wolf he needs to be, as he also gets mixed up with the coven trying to revive Lilith. Honestly, it's not a bad premise, and it does lead to some fun moments, even if that fun comes from a sense of irony, especially the opening music.
Until now.
It borders those lines of so bad it's good, but also in some cases its cheesiness and low budget nature lends way to some unironically fun moments as well. For the most part, they use some practical effects which vary depending on how it's used. Sometimes it looks fun and cheesy, coming off as cheap, but in other moments it's effective in selling the scene. The same could be said for the CGI effects as well. Sometimes it's really bad, but in other times it's somewhat impressive for it being a 2009 low budget film. Acting wise, it's pretty bad across the board, which is kind of surprising even coming from Alex, who you might remember as Kim Possible or Ren Stevens. The rest of the cast are all pretty bad too, but some are better than others. Most of the film looks horrendous when it comes to cinematography, with poor lighting that comes off as digitally graining, where instead of using proper lighting, they just push the camera's ISO. You can really tell this with a scene where Russell gets into the fridge as this void of grain when he's in the fridge, but then it cuts to the low light scene with heavy digital grain. There's also scenes where it looks out of focus, moments of the camera movement can come off as amateurish, and there's an abundance of close-ups even when it's showing a wider area where the image just constantly feels cropped. The plot of the story is okay, but the dialogue is hilarious. Russell has a soft character arc where he shifts from being a callous businessman to a helping and more caring individual, but everyone else is pretty one-dimensional that gets no development. There's also this weird lineage with Russell and Van Helsing's group. Oh yeah, Van Helsing shows up in this, but not the good one. This discovery of his lineage just felt out of place and shoehorned in there. Russell's werewolf attack was completely random. Were the vampires always just going to go after him because of his grandfather or great-grandfather? I can't remember now, past dealings, you know. What would happen if he doesn't get the furry powers? It's just a weird route to go that I don't understand why. Oh yeah, that's right. It was convenient for the plot. Duh, makes sense now. Honestly though, Wolvesbayne was a little better than I expected and should be lumped into that pile of not good movies, but something worth putting on in the background of a party where you and your friends just glance at it from time to time, laugh at its set pieces, and continue on with whatever you're doing. And I'm giving this one a 3 out of 10. Violence in a Women's Prison from 1982, directed by Bruno Mattei, was released by Severin Films and was actually a film my wife wanted to get. So way back when Severin was doing one of their Black Friday 50% off deals, I ordered it along with a few other films, including Emmanuelle and The Last Cannibals, after my wife piqued some interest in the Black Emmanuelle series. Black Emmanuelle is a series of Italian softcore sexploitation films, mostly starring Laura Jimzer as Emmanuelle, typically a reporter doing some reporting when she gets caught up into some shenanigans. Violence in a Women's Prison is the 8th entry into this unconnected series, with it being the 7th to have Laura Jimzer to star as Emmanuelle. I say unconnected because there's really no continuity between the films, or at least from what I've seen. Violence starts as Emmanuelle and other prisoners are being transported to the prison that's ran by a brutal warden and her gang of torturous guards that makes life a living hell inside the prison. The film jumps around between different characters for the purpose of some softcore sex scenes, before finally centering on Emmanuelle and the plot of the film a little more than halfway in. This incohesion for the purpose of a titillation actually really hurts the film. Sure, you get to see some boobies and whatnot, but where's the plot? Where's the story? Where's the emotion? Honestly, once the plot gets going, so does the film. Basically, Emmanuelle falsifies her crime in order to infiltrate the prison to write a piece on the treatment of its inmates. Once the guards become privy of it, it actually turns into a decent mystery/prison escape movie. Of course, throughout, characters make stupid decisions in order to fill the runtime with some bazoombas, but it's definitely the better part of the film. The prison's kind of like a co-ed prison with like a section of a male prison, so there's that point for some of the scenes, I suppose. Most of the film is dubbed over, since movies like this were basically filmed without any audio, since it's a weird mix of different nationalities and native speakers that the genre like this is filled with, so their solution was just to dub everything, which honestly led to some hilarious moments, especially with one of the male prisoners.
Can't you see what she's doing to you? Stop it at once. She's turning all of you into a bunch of drooling savages.
I also love the music in the film. I just love the corny music that kind of haunts these films in this genre. For the most part, the violence of the film is rather corny with some bad blood makeup, but much of the violence comes in the form of sexual violence in terms of some pretty hefty trigger words. There is a scene where Emmanuelle gets thrown into solitary where she is attacked and swarmed by a plague of rats, and I'm genuinely curious on how they made the rats have these red eyes. It's a cool effect as long as no rats were harmed. There's also a gross poop fight where Emmanuelle throws a canteen on the guard and they just kind of roll around in it, which is gross, but it doesn't necessarily look like what they're trying to sell. The transfer from Severin looks great for what it is, and I do like the fact that they used real stunts to sell some of the effects. Like there's a scene where a girl gets thrown off the edge of this dirt mound and it looks rough. There's also a wide-angle long shot of someone rappelling down the side of the prison that was pretty cool too. Overall though, there really isn't too much to say about this one. It's not anything amazing, it has some fun moments, some decent visuals. The visuals are really the standout. I mean, this is a very visual movie. The visuals! Oh my god, the visuals! In all seriousness though, this isn't a very good film either. It's got a weak plot with bad acting and dubbing that can lead to some very unintentionally funny moments. The same could be said about the score. If you like these kind of movies, then go for it. But if you're not a fan of these kind of things, then you should probably pass on it. I'm giving it a 3 out of 10. From one exploitation into another with Rise of the Machine Girls from 2019. I'm a huge fan of Japanese exploitation movies, also known as J-exploitation, because these films typically blend a heavy amount of bloody violence and over-the-top comical nature that I just find super entertaining. I love movies like Tokyo Gore Police, Hell Driver, and The Machine Girl as well, and Rise of the Machine Girl fits perfectly into that category with those other films. Now there is a film called The Machine Girl that I just mentioned from 2008 that I recommend if you're wanting to jump into a genre like this, but I'm not sure if Rise is connected or not. The writing credits of IMDb for Rise of the Machine Girl list Noboru Iguchi for the original characters, Iguchi being the writer and director of The Machine Girl from 2008. I just can't find anywhere else on the internet from mild searching for a connection for the two besides that. I guess also besides maybe the weapon ligaments and the schoolgirl style outfits, there isn't too much in the story to connect the two, or at least from what I remember from The Machine Girl from 2008. It's been several years at this point since I've watched it. Maybe I should rewatch it sometime soon. Anyways, Rise of the Machine Girls follows two sisters who were sold to an organ harvesting business who wants to seek revenge. The film is set in a futuristic wasteland dystopia where people sell their body parts or babies for money. The girls meet up with an assassin to take down the evil corporation. The story is simple and just really here to set up the larger action set pieces. Everything here is cranked to 10, from the overacting, the props, costume design, violence, blood, upskirt shots, and the music. It's just an overload at points that makes an already short hour and 15 runtime just fly by. The visual effects are super bad, which is something that I had normally complained about. I know I did in last year's video about Tag, but the difference here is this film is played much more at full throttle with no fucks given to anything. It's this carefree attitude and comic nature of the film that felt pretty void in my opinion in Tag that leads for a film like this to almost get a free pass from me because it adds to the charm and tone of the film. Sure, practical effects or higher end effects would have been better, probably, but I don't know. I just find it more enjoyable laughing at it, and I think that's kind of the point. There's really not much to say about this one. It's exactly what it wants to be. A fun and stupid J-exploitation film that's frantic and doesn't take anything too serious, but also allows itself to build its characters enough for you to somewhat care about them, especially during the ending. Speaking of the ending, there's a long one take with a lot of action pieces and some cool effects, and I liked how they sped up moments to get past the longer sections, and it helped add some energy to the scene. It's actually really well executed, and the Blu-ray comes with some special features that plays the one cut without any of the speed editing effects, so that's pretty cool too. Honestly, I just had a good time with this one. It's a fun jaunt that doesn't overstay its welcome and has some really good moments with some solid comical villains. Oh, one last thing. They do set up this assassin guild organization thing that ranks its assassins, and I would have loved the film to explore that a little more. Maybe it's a spin-off or something, but they set it up enough to where it seems like it could be filled with some wacky assassins that would be endlessly entertaining. As for this movie though, I'm giving it a 6.5 out of 10. Force Majeure from 2014 is a movie that I want to lie and say I haven't had since release and never watched it, but the truth is, I've had it since release and I've never watched it. It's a Swedish film about a family going to the French Alps for a ski vacation when one day, during an outdoor lunch, an avalanche comes straight for them. Thomas, the husband, played by Johannes Konk. If I pronounce names wrong, I'm sorry. I tried to look them up. Sometimes it just seems weird. Anyway, his character says the avalanche is a controlled one. As the rolling snow grows larger and larger, coming closer and closer, the diners begin to panic as they believe the avalanche is going to hit them. This moment of panic causes Thomas to run away, leaving his family behind to be engulfed by the storm. While the avalanche comes up just short of the restaurant, just leaving a cloud of snow to linger. Eva, played by Lisa Loven-Kongsley, and her two kids huddled, clutched together at the table as they realized Thomas grabbed his phone and abandoned them. This scene is played up for laughs, in the way that Thomas almost cartoonishly runs off, leaving them behind got a genuine laugh out of me, which this film does balance tone really well. This event ripples throughout the rest of the film, making Eva question their relationship that might have already been at a rocky point, even furthering when they have dinner with friends and Thomas denies that he even fled the scene. Clearly this event broke the trust of Eva, and Thomas denying it even further dents that trust. The way the film glides between humorous to dramatic and emotional is quite impressive, and the great performances by Lisa Loven-Kongsley and Johannes Konk help tie it together. This is a complex relationship, and the film uses the event and other moments throughout the film to mirror or metaphorically show the relationship's structure. Their relationship even affecting their friends when they show up and talk about the event. That led that couple to talking about their trust in each other as well, and begs the question on what you would do in that situation. It asks how strong your relationship is, showcasing how a damaged and bad relationship can affect those around you. There's a lot presented here that could be taken at face value, but also feels like it needs dug out a little deeper with multiple viewings. It's entertaining enough to warrant those multiple viewings as well, even if the pacing at times can feel uneven. Visually, the film looks awesome. Some moments felt like they were green screen, but I can't say for sure. Besides the bus scene, which felt very green screened, most of the film is filled with wide shots to help you sink into that voyeurism of watching the couple from afar, but also adds some distance between them as well to showcase how their relationship has drifted apart. It's some great shot composition and framing. I loved it on a visual aspect. Plus, I love all the snow. That's a bonus for me. Musically, I found the film to be somewhat annoying. Most of the movie doesn't really have any music, but the film uses Vivaldi's Four Seasons Summer like a million times, and it got somewhat annoying after a while. My only other real complaint would be the two child actors that plays Thomas and Eva's children, as their performances were pretty bad throughout the entire film, really clashing with one scene towards the end. With no spoilers, that was a very emotional scene, but because of their performance, it didn't let me get fully enveloped into it. I guess there's an American remake of this film called Downhill, starring Will Ferrell and Julia Louis-Dreyfus from 2020, that I wouldn't mind checking out at some point, but after watching the trailer, it looks pretty awful comparatively to this film. Force Majeure, though, is a pretty solid drama with some good comedic elements and great performances that I would definitely recommend checking out for sure. It's one that another watch or two could go up or down in score. More than likely it would go up, but it's definitely worth checking out, and I'm giving this one a 7.5 out of 10. Das Boot, or The Boat, is a German war film from 1981 directed by Wolfgang Petersen, who is apparently a director of a lot of movies that I think are pretty good that I never knew he directed. I picked up the Project Pop Art Steelbook at Best Buy a while ago. When these steelbooks released, I grabbed a good handful of them, and Das Boot was one I grabbed due to it being on IMDb's top 250 list. Ever since then, years and years go by, and I never watched it until now, and I can cross this one off my list. This film is interesting because it's a World War II film focusing on the German Nazi soldier point of view. The film follows a Navy platoon on their U-boats heading into battle attacking British shipping boats. The film opens with text saying that out of 40,000 soldiers on U-boats, 30,000 never returned. It's a soft open with this text that kicks into a group of soldiers partying. A drunk captain gets on stage where he says some potentially negative things about Hitler when some of the troops tense up. He backtracks his words, but this scene sets the seed that not every soldier is on board with the Fuhrer, and that statement ripples throughout the film. The film is an examination into what life was like for these soldiers on the U-boats and doesn't sugarcoat anything really. The film humanizes what we would call evil. Now, presenting a story like this would definitely have to toe the line, since it easily could be fallen into that category of Nazi sympathizing, which I personally don't believe the film does. It shows that not everyone believed in Hitler's plan and humanizes some of the soldiers to showcase that these are people in a situation trying to survive on their own, while mixing in the beliefs that they might think they're the good guys as well. Sure, there are some that clearly buy into the propaganda and the agenda of the Third Reich, but it does a decent job at showcasing everybody without sympathizing toward the evils of the movement. I love the interior of the boat as it seemed believable and looked great. It's tight and cramped, and the camera moves pretty much in one vertical axis that runs the length of the boat to sell it even further. These tight, cramped spaces, along with the sound design and the fact that there is constantly water dripping from somewhere, amplifies the claustrophobia of the ship. When engaged in battle, it's intense, and when the film gets toward the back end without spoilers, it does feel hopeless and dreadful. My biggest issue with the film is honestly the lack of characters. We have a large cast and the cast give great performances, but honestly the film gives little background to the characters, which when they aren't in scenes of action can tend to feel to drag on and on and on. Sure, the character performances are great and showing you how the characters think, but without some backstory or more interesting dialogue, the downtime scenes are just that, they're downtime. This is a 2.5 hour movie and I can feel it. Honestly, I wouldn't mind giving it another watch and maybe the dialogue scenes would land a little better for me, but I had moments where I thought to myself I was ready for it to move on. There's a lot in this film to appreciate for sure, especially the use of practical effects and the set design. The makeup and wardrobe was amazing to make the sailors look just as filthy and pale from sea life as they're supposed to. I guess according to IMDb trivia, it was basically impossible to get audio on set during the scenes inside the U-boat, so they were dubbed over in post. And while it's slightly noticeable at some points, the ADR is actually really great and pretty unnoticeable through most of the movie. I will say some of the scenes where the sailors are on lookout, it's a pretty noticeable green screen, but other than that, everything looks pretty amazing. I just kind of wish I got more into it from a narrative standpoint. That's again why I'm open to a rewatch. Maybe my rating could go up. I doubt it would go down. It is worth noting that this set did come with the director's cut as well as the theatrical cut. I watched the theatrical cut. I personally, for the first time viewing, always liked watching what was released in theaters, since that's what everybody else got to see first. My second viewing would probably be the director's cut though. Das Boot is definitely worth a recommendation, especially if you like war films, because from the setting and the viewpoint, it's unlike a lot of the other war films. I'm giving this one a 6.5 out of 10.
Leviathan unfortunately has the same backstory as Force Majeure, where I bought it on release either late 2014 or early 2015. I honestly can't remember when the Blu-ray came out, but I knew I bought it on release due to YMS giving it a pretty positive review, but for some reason I just never watched it. Now I know I'm going to butcher names here with this one, but bear with me. Leviathan is a Russian film directed by Andrei Zanyaginstev about Kola, played by Alexis Bryakov, and his family fighting a corrupt mayor who is purchasing his house for demolition, and Kola brings out his old army buddy, now a lawyer, Dmitry, played by Vladimir Vidyavinchenkov, to help fight the mayor. However, with Dimitri's presence, things begin to worsen. Those are some names, man. Sorry if I sound a little stuffed up or congested, but the film is based around the Book of Job and Marvin Heemeyer's story, aka The Killdozer. If you don't know anything about The Killdozer or Marvin Heemeyer, there's an amazing documentary called Tread that goes into great details about the story, and I definitely recommend that one. It's a super interesting story. The inspiration from Leviathan from their sources really show as the film progresses, and honestly, this is going to be a hard one to talk about without spoiling the film. The film is rich with character. The outstanding performances from the cast make the main characters feel believable, as if documented rather than performed. Exposition doesn't explain the characters nor deliver their backstory, but rather their performances and interactions between each other with seeds of information help them blossom into deep and rich characters that organically build their characters' history and chemistry with each other on screen. You believe in their connection, and you feel for Cola as his life basically is stripped away from him. The camaraderie between the characters, especially during the drinking scenes, really help strip away who they really are. Apparently, according to the IMDb trivia, the cast would actually drink during these scenes, and by like the 8th or 9th take, they were really sauced up. The drunk scenes were some of the most believable I've ever seen before because, well, I mean, they were really drunk. It really helps sell the realism that the film is building. The story is compelling as you just see where it takes Cola down this rabbit hole. It's oppressive for sure, that makes the narrative strike with an emotional core. That narrative also leaving some ambiguity as to what happens in the final act that I really love. It's really open to some interpretations. It presents information to allow the viewers to go down multiple paths that all seem to have a strong argument for its case. I love endings like that, and it really sews together the narrative's message of justice, faith, and power. The film actually also reminded me a lot of Satan Tango in tone and its rather patient nature. Leviathan is nowhere near as slow or as long, but it's also a slow burn that feels like a spiritual successor and personally more enjoyable for an experience, but it still reminded me of the 1994 film in context. The film has some beautiful cinematography and a few visual foreshadowings that I love. There's a shot early on in the film that felt purposeful and interesting because I felt like it was foreshadowing something that would happen later down the road, and I was right. It's foreshadowing something simple and did make the revelation predictable, but not in the way that it felt pandering or so predictable that it's annoying. It felt more like a reward to paying attention to its visuals and story. My biggest issues with the film would just have to be the fact that the score was so middling. It doesn't feel like it has much presence or even that memorable, and personally the fact that the film is so very heavy in tone, it's a dense film with little hope that's definitely a downer, that makes some rewatches a mood point for sure. It's not something I'm going to pop in every year or so. I'd definitely watch it again, so don't get me wrong on that. It's a fantastic film with almost all positives to say, but I definitely need to be in the mood for something like this. It falls into that category of, yes, it's a masterpiece, but it hurt my feelings, so it's not going to go in the pick-me-up pile. I know that's a weird thing to criticize, a film's dour nature, but it's worth mentioning if it's going to reflect the desire to watch it again. This without a doubt goes into the pile of must-watches at least once, and I'm sure on multiple rewatches there's more things to pick up on, and I eventually will definitely be rewatching this for that purpose, but again, I just feel like I need to be kind of in the right mood. Again, this is another film I'm kicking myself for waiting so long to watch it. It would have easily been near the top of my best of 2014 list. It's masterclass in filmmaking. It makes me want to check out more of Andrei Znyagintstev's other films. These names. I honestly can't recommend this one enough, and I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10. Onibaba from 1964 is a Japanese horror film that's always been on my watch list and isn't one that's been in the collection for very long before finally getting viewed. I grabbed the Blu-ray Criterion release during the half-off sale at Barnes & Noble, the sale that happened pretty much like right after Onibaba's release. This is a film that I've always heard about and have always been interested in, so I'm glad to finally sit down and watch it. The film is about two women living in a hut hidden in this super tall blade grass during a massive war in feudal Japan. They scavenge dead samurais for their swords and armors to sell for food and other items, but mostly they murder the samurais for the gear instead. Onibaba translates into Demon Hag, and that's a pretty fitting title once their neighbor shows up. He was sent to war with their son of the older woman and the husband to the younger woman. When he returns to tell them that Kichi, the son and husband of the two ladies, is dead, killed in the war, the neighbor Hachi begins to somewhat help the two ladies kill the samurai and sell the goods because he wants the younger woman for himself. Soon the two start a fling when the mother becomes wildly jealous because of her fear of being alone. This fear drives her to try to take Hachi for herself until one night when a samurai in a demon mask shows up. First off, I have to say this is a pretty brutal and disturbing film from the early 60s. I guess mid-60s. Either way, there's a lot of dead bodies in the beginning of the film when they're ripping off the armor from the warrior corpses, and they're some of the most realistic dead bodies I've seen in a film. They're stiff and I could never see them breathe if they were breathing, but they definitely didn't look fake. I don't know, but it just got to me. The film thrusts you into the face of war right out of the gate. This isn't a bloody film by any means, but it's disturbing without a doubt. I guess it depends on what you find disturbing, I suppose. The mother character played by Nobuko Ottawa. If I'm mispronouncing names, I apologize, but she gave an amazing performance as a very sad and lonely character, just trying to survive and cling on to what she has left. This pretty much carries throughout the story, as her compulsions is what drives the tone of the film, the relationships mirroring the war surrounding them. This is exacerbated by beautiful cinematography. Everything is shrouded by this tall blade grass, which presents a unique environment that characters are moving through. It almost feels like an impressive maze in a way. The black and white looks great as it's a bit more contrasted look rather than just a flat black and white, which allows some of the moments to look horrific, especially once the mask shows up. I also really love the music throughout the film as well. It's very fitting, and there's this like drum theme that I really loved as it helped fill the atmosphere and was fitting when it was reused. My biggest issue would be the dubbing. There's some really bad dubbing, especially the scene when Hanshi comes back from the war front, but there's a lot of scenes where the dubbing is noticeably off or just bad, which really took me out of the atmosphere. Now, by no means is this a straight up horror film. It is pretty much in the last act, but the film is mostly a drama between three characters set in a pretty horrific world. We get some really disturbing moments at the beginning of the film which helps set the tone of the world and pull you in, but the bulk of the film is just the three and their conflicts of interest. By no means though is it boring, because the three main characters, especially the two girls, are really well developed. From how the characters are presented, it comes off more sad than scary, and even becomes heartbreakingly sad at the end of the film. This is definitely a mood of a film. Overall though, it's a pretty solid film that I'm glad I finally watched. It looks great in terms of the transfer, but I wouldn't expect any less from Criterion. If this seems interesting to you, then I would definitely recommend checking it out. It would be a good recommendation for someone wanting to get into classic Japanese cinema, and I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. Also, sorry if I sound sick. I'm still trying to get stuff flushed from my head. So, bye. Human Lanterns is actually probably one of the newest in the collection in terms of this list. I picked it up on vacation at a place I've mentioned many times before called Rhythm Section in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I'm not sponsored, I just genuinely love that store, and they have a great horror selection. I came across Human Lanterns and was immediately interested in it based on the cover artwork. It's some dope artwork. I've never heard of this before, and after reading the back, I knew it was coming home with me. It's a Hong Kong Kung Fu exploitation slasher film. That is a mouthful of yes words for me. The film is about two masters who are in a heated rivalry against each other. The one hires a master lantern maker to make a lantern to help outstage his rival. When he discovers the lantern maker is actually a rival he bested for his wife's marriage. However, the lantern maker sees this as a chance for his revenge. When he's making the lantern, people start going missing, and what exactly the lantern making is making comes out to a grisly realization. This is without a doubt a blast of a film. It's goofy and over the top with a lot of cheesy effects and fighting that kept me entertained throughout. The fight choreography is that over the top wire work like a lot of older martial arts movies have, and it's no different here, and it's a ton of fun. There's moments where you can see the wires and it just adds to the motif. And there's actually some really good and smooth fight choreography besides those exaggerated moves that was actually quite impressive. One thing I found constantly hilarious during these fight scenes was the overuse of the same stock sound effects. Basically every weapon and movement has one of two sound effects that repeated to ad nauseum, but I found it to be hilarious as the film went on. Most of the blood looks like melted crowns. The skin used for some of the lanterns just looks like white wet sheets with a bit of red staining, but all these flaws kind of add to its exploitative style that helps with its tone. There's a ton of bad dubbing that's pretty entertaining as well. Something that would be normally an issue, like in yesterday's episode about Onibaba, where it breaks the atmosphere and becomes distracting, whereas in Human Lanterns it adds to the enjoyment factor because of how silly the film is. Yes, this is a silly film, but it's actually played very straight-laced as a murder mystery with horror and slasher elements, but it's one of those rare moments where playing it straight-laced like this, with all these wacky elements that actually complement each other really well and building its own unique tone that amplifies otherwise it's goofy enjoyment. One thing that's also pretty impressive is the set and costume design. Most of the environment is large sets such as buildings and towns that's clearly on a soundstage or something. Not sure if it was built for this movie or maybe reused from another one of the Shaw Brothers productions, but regardless, it looks great here. Wardrobe is also pretty impressive as well. It's a bright and colorful film in terms of set design, and it works really well. I absolutely adore the villain's getup. His costume and mask is absolutely awesome. I'd totally cosplay as a fat version of that for sure. It's a very strong and striking look that works well as a villain. I also loved how the villain moves. His martial arts style is completely different from the protagonist's movesets, and it really helps deepen his character because of his primal and incredibly fast movements mixed with his overbearing strength. He comes off as a real threat, which concretes him as a very good villain. Musically though, I'm writing this after watching the movie and I don't remember any of the music whatsoever. I'm not even sure if there's music in this film. If there was, it's obviously incredibly forgettable and not even noticeable. Another thing was just kind of how predictable the film is. Sure, it's fun, but I could tell exactly how the film was going to play out, and sadly, I was never wrong. It goes the most predictable route, which does hurt the mystery of the film and weakens the reveal. Honestly, they demasked the villain very early on, and if they wouldn't have done that, the reveal at the end of the film would have been 1,000 times more impactful, and honestly would have raised my rating of the film quite a bit. Still, this is a super good fun time that I would highly recommend checking out. If you're into these kind of wacky, over-the-top exploitative style films, this is definitely something right up your alley. I'm sure some would think this is really stupid, and while yes it is, I still can't recommend it enough. I have my issues with it, but it's definitely one I will be watching again, and I'm giving this one a 7.5 out of 10. That's one of those ratings too that could go up on a second viewing, and I apologize for still sounding pretty sick, but I'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy. Bye. Blow from 2001, directed by Ted Demme and starring Johnny Depp, is a film that I've always wanted to see and just never have. I actually found this one more recently as well. I can't remember if it was earlier this year or later last year, but this is one that I just never got around to. The film is based on the true story of George Young, a drug smuggler who made a fortune smuggling in cocaine for the likes of Pablo Escobar. Moving from Massachusetts to California, he and a friend begin selling weed, which eventually spills into cocaine and the cartel, eventually getting out of hand, in and out of jail, all while trying to have family life with his wife and daughter. There's a lot here that I tend to enjoy in a film. Being centered around a crime syndicate and evading the law is the basis for some of my favorite films, with Johnny Depp in the lead giving a great performance that isn't Hunter S. Thompson, or aka Jack Sparrow-ish, can be refreshing as he is an amazing actor. However, I just found myself at points bored and uninterested in the story. There are some great moments here. I love the prison scene where George is talking to the cellmate who will eventually become his partner, and I loved how it's visually presented. There are some good visuals here, and for the most part the cinematography is great. All the performances are pretty good as well, but Depp is definitely the standout for sure. There's some good moments of licensed music that's fitting for the tone and time of the film. My biggest issue probably comes down to the pacing and the writing. George is a very well developed character, and Depp brings him to life as we watch for him to hopefully get the best outcome. However, the other characters are rather one note without much screen time or development besides maybe George's mother and father, rest in peace Ray. The film chooses to avoid some of the more dramatic moments like the actual smuggling or selling of the drugs. Pretty much the entire film is either doing drugs or talking about it, which can honestly lead to a lot of downtime in its 2-hour runtime. Some of the scenes could have been completely trimmed out of the film, and it would have had the same effect to develop George and tell his story that they wanted to present here. I should also mention that Paul Reubens has a role in the film, and it's always great to see him show up, even though just every time I see him I think of Pee-wee. Definitely Depp helped carry this film to the end for me, but I have to say I'm a little disappointed with this. This is one when the roulette hit I was really excited to finally watch it. It was honestly probably in like my top 10 most excited in this list to watch, which coming away with not much to say about it kinda sucks. I still think this is a decent film, and maybe you won't find some of the moments as boring as I did, or maybe you'll connect with the film more. It's definitely one that I'd still recommend checking out, as it's a very digestible film, but for me I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. Hiruko the Goblin is one of the earlier Shinya Tsukamoto films in his lineup, Tsukamoto being a director I've covered on the channel in a video called Solid Metal Nightmares. There will be a link in the description to that video if you want to check that one out later. In the video I went through the Shinya Tsukamoto box set Solid Metal Nightmares put out by Arrow Video, which is a collection of Tsukamoto's films, but it's missing a few. A couple of those missing from the set have been put out by Mondo Macabro, Gemini, and now Hiruko the Goblin. I wasn't able to get Gemini and Mondo's limited red case, but I was quick enough to get Hiruko in the red case, so that's pretty cool. Tsukamoto has become one of my favorite directors. I still have a couple of his films to get to, but Hiruko is the 10th film of his I've seen, and I've been able to find something to enjoy in every single one of them. Hiruko follows an archaeologist, that is a hard word for me to say, who receives a letter from an old colleague. This colleague and a student go missing after exploring a tomb, and the missing professor's son and his friends are looking for him and the student. When the boy is about to be attacked by something, the archaeologist shows up and saves him. The archaeologist believes a goblin is loose and the two must find everyone and solve the issue. It's a pretty simple story, but it's told pretty effectively. If you've seen some of Tsukamoto's other films, Hiruko the Goblin stands out, but not in the sense that you think it would. It stands out because it's a pretty straightforward standard horror film that, while yes it has many Tsukamoto-isms, it doesn't feel like a true Tsukamoto film. The style is probably better compared to something like Evil Dead or San Raimi rather than Tetsuo or Tsukamoto. However, this is still a really fun, bloody horror film with some great direction. It may not have that frantic energy of Tsukamoto's other works, but he still put together a pretty fun and campy flick here. There's a lot of use of puppetry because the goblin basically decapitates everyone, and then their heads grow like these spider legs and run around. It's really fun and really well done. There's a good amount of blood spraying all over the place, and I really loved the goblin POV shots, which is kind of what put me in mind so much of the Evil Dead, because it feels very similar to the POV shots there. This is a pretty simple story that can be pretty predictable at times, but I don't think this is a film that's trying to be anything more than what it is. It knows its tone as to be a goofy horror film, but it does build some good characters, especially the lead boy Masao, who is the missing professor's son. The film adds in some ancient lore that's fun, but it's nothing special, and our two leads that get almost all the screen time both do a great job. There's a lot to enjoy here, but there are some things I found to be a little off-putting. For one, the music. Oh man, is the music terrible. Almost all the music feels like it's ripped from a PBS show that's just thrown over top of this horror comedy. Even one that's as goofy as this is, the music is just super unfitting. Like, I feel like I should be learning something about 90s libraries or something when this music plays. They do have this one song where the girl goblin would sing it, and it's fine for what they're trying to do with it, but the rest of the music's pretty bad. There's also this one scene with green screened heads and fire that you can see the matting on the flames, which is hilarious, but also really bad. The film did feel somewhat anticlimactic because most of the movie is them trying to survive, but when it comes to figuring out how to solve the problem, they find the solution very conveniently and they kind of just fix the problems with ease that left it feeling somewhat anticlimactic. Other than that though, Hiruko the Goblin is a really fun time that feels different for a Tsukamoto outing. In that video I did about the box set, I did rank his films from my favorite to least, and with Hiruko I would probably put it somewhere around Tokyo Fist, maybe below Tokyo Fist. It's a solid film that I would definitely recommend. I think if you wanted to get into Shinya Tsukamoto specifically, I would probably recommend some of his other films first, but if you're looking for a fun Japanese horror flick with a good amount of comedy to it, then definitely give Hiruko the Goblin a shot. The Mondo Macabro transfer looks absolutely amazing as a transfer, and I'm giving this one a 7 out of 10. Calvaire, also known as The Ordeal, is a French film that I've heard about before and found the DVD to at a pawn shop for only $1. Now I don't believe this has a US Blu-ray, and I believe the DVD is out of print because it goes for a decent amount, so finding it for $1 was pretty sweet despite some damages to the insert spine. I want to say out of the gate, this was not a fun viewing. The film follows Mark, who is a singer and performer playing at an old folks home when he ventures to his next gig. Along the way he begins to have van troubles when some guy in the middle of the rainy night comes up to the van asking Mark if he's seen his dog. Mark questions the guy about seeing a sign for an inn since the van was having issues. The man leads him back to Bartel, a seemingly older innkeeper who says he can fix Mark's van, but from there things start to go wrong very quickly. I want to say if you've ever seen a Gaspar Noé film, then you're right at home here on what to expect. Actually, it's somewhat surprising this isn't a Noé film because of how similar the style of the film is. Along the way you're subjected to some brutal violence, incredibly weird and creepy characters, pig and some regular
Open wide, kids!
'cause I'm gonna grape you in the mouth!
Like I said, this is not a fun movie as you watch what Mark gets devolved into. It's heartbreaking, but what was really surprising was Bartel, as the film really develops him with empathy, where you almost feel sad for him as well. This is one of those films that you honestly probably get more out of on a second viewing if you want to put yourself through that thing again, through the dialogue, foreshadowing, and how the characters interact. I'm sure there's a lot to dissect here. The IMDb trivia stated that the director said that the film really only has two characters, Mark and Bartel, the other characters being extensions of Bartel, and I got a little of that while watching the film. It's something that maybe knowing into it on a second viewing would deepen the horror of the film. There's moments and dialogue that lean into it, but it doesn't quite fully commit to that point, so thankfully it doesn't ruin itself like High Tension does. Because if you start to look at the film in that light, that these are just the same character, just different extensions of that character, it can become kind of confusing and jumbled. Maybe on a second viewing that aspect will click a little more, and I do kind of see where he's coming from with saying that. The film though still acknowledges those other characters. It's clearish to me that this isn't quite all one man, if that makes sense. Who knows, maybe a second viewing will change my mind on that. Either way, I have to give some props to some of the scenes here. The way the film presents some of the moments visually is inspiring. There's 3 scenes in particular that made me go, wow.
You'll be saying wow every time.
The scene where Mark is tied up to the chair with Bartel and Boris as the camera spins around. It added so much chaos and really sanctified the horror. The next, which is my favorite scene of the whole film, was the shootout scene. It's some of the most realistic gunshots I've ever heard, and it's mixed with the sound editing to distort the mayhem, and then the camera whirling and following Mark as to enrich that distortion. It's expertly done and really was a standout of the film. The other scene that really impressed me was basically a Gaspar Noé scene. It's a top-down view scene where the pig family gets a hold of Mark. I won't show much here because of the graphic nature of the scene, but the way the camera moves reminded me a lot of a shot that you typically see in a Gaspar Noé film. Just the choreography in the scene between the actors here is really well done. This is without a doubt a really well directed film, and I wouldn't mind checking out some more from Fabrice Duels. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I also loved the decision to pretty much exclude music from the film entirely, making that void even thicker as you're pushed into its bleak ordeal. It really complements the tone and could have lessened it if there was music there. My biggest issue with the film comes just from the nature of the film. This is without a doubt a good film that's very horrific, but feels mean in its nature. There's a lot of disturbing, mean-spirited films that I love. Don't mean I enjoy rewatching them, but with ones like Martyrs or Irreversible, Threads, or something akin, they're presenting something that can be taken away from the violence and the disturbing nature of the film. While Calvaire presents techniques to study, it doesn't present a deeper message or really a unique way to tell a story. It brutally beats its character in front of you without a second glance, pulling them and you through the blood and mud, confronting you mainly with just a brutality that comes off in a mean-spirited way. That may be commendable, but it doesn't make for a good time or a revolutionary one either. Yes, it's asking for a second viewing in my opinion, but it feels like it's only asking for that second viewing so it can put you back through it again. I'm not sure, but it might be a little while before I find that out. That nature can reflect your opinion of a film. There's a lot to merit here, especially in the performances, as the entire cast, especially the 2 leads, both give outstanding performances. Even with that technical prowess though, when you look back on a film, you should take personal experience and enjoyment into that account. Like I said, this is not a fun time, which can be the point to a lot of films. This isn't one that I'd easily recommend to people though. I can really only think of a few people that I would definitely recommend this to because of what it is. If it sounds interesting to you, then definitely give it a shot because there's a lot to appreciate here on how well made it is. Hopefully one day we'll get a Blu-ray in the US because the DVD quality is definitely not the best transfer. You can tell that it's a grainy film to begin with, but the DVD's compression mixed with the transfer doesn't help at all. I'd definitely upgrade this to Blu-ray whenever or if ever it gets released on a Blu-ray, and hopefully that's when my second viewing will happen, but I'm giving this one a 7.5 out of 10. It could go up on a second viewing, it could go down on a second viewing, more than likely it will probably go up, but this is a rough one to sit through. Thank you, bye. Detective Story from 2007 is a Japanese film directed by none other than Takashi Miike himself. Miike is one of my favorite directors, even though I've only seen about a quarter of his films, but the man's made over 100 films so far, so yeah. Anyway, Detective Story is one that I found at a little mom and pop shop record store with a very, very small movie selection. The case was in horrible shape, but the disc looked great. I swapped out the cases when I got home, and it looks pretty good again besides this weird sticker on the insert artwork. It will never come off. It's there forever. I don't know why people would do this. I'm sure this is an old rental copy, but still, it just makes me sad. The film is about Raida, a businessman moving into his new apartment, when he meets his neighbor, a private eye named Raida. Quickly after their meeting, a string of strange murders begin taking place when dead bodies show up with organs missing. When the local police suspect the private eye, Raida, to be a potential suspect, he must clear his name and find the real killer, along with getting businessman Raida caught up in the debacle as well. This is a pretty standard outing for Miike. The film is first and foremost a detective murder mystery with some elements of horror and humor. Miike has a ton of movies in his career, and while some are better than others, most carries a certain directorial flair that has made at least the ones I've watched, for the most part, pretty enjoyable. His gonzo frantic direction can really elevate a film beyond what its base is, and while there's moments of that, his style is more subtle, which I feel like the film needed more of to really stand out. Sure, there's moments where Miike peeks through from the editing to the camera work to some of the really gross and bloody horror elements, but they act as a peak in the film. A lot of the film is filled with bad acting and unconvincing dialogue that can lead to some of the mystery solving feeling stale. Most attempts at humor really didn't land for me, and honestly, a lot of the bumbling that the private eye Raida does comes off as frustrating after a while. The plot is really predictable as well. It's a pretty safe by the numbers murder mystery plot that even had a twist ending that I called from earlier on. Speaking of that twist, I personally didn't like it. Not because I was able to see it from a mile away, but because it doesn't make much sense in terms of the character, where it feels so forced rather than developed. It's not a satisfying twist. But with that being said, there are some things here I really enjoy. For one, this movie does have some generally gross moments. A lot of the artwork looks amazing, especially the big painting. It looks absolutely gruesome. I liked some of the jumpy editing and how Miike blocks some of his scenes. I also really enjoyed the ending in terms of the direction when it comes to how chaotic it gets. Sure, I didn't like the twist, but Miike at least amped it up enough to make it watchable. I also really liked some of the score, especially the opening piece, where it's this like horrorish droning with some random brass sections. In terms visually, Miike can be all over the place. Some of his films have amazing cinematographies, and others, like Detective Story, is clearly shot on a cheaper digital camera. However, I do think that look fits a little better with the story here. It looks older and probably cheaper than what it is, but it adds to the tone of the film. One thing I found weird was there's a scene with a dead body that was blurred, like it was censored blurred, not out of focus blur. Not sure what was up with that. Also, did the bathhouse scene really need to have a naked kid running around the scene through the whole time? It felt pretty unnecessary. There's also a scene that was pretty much ripped right out of Silence of the Lambs that could have easily been cut from the movie and not made any difference. It really didn't add much at all and was kind of just distracting due to how much it felt just lifted from that film. Like, yeah, you can copy homework, but don't make it too obvious. Overall though, I don't have much to say about this one, even though it is a Takashi Miike film. Last year Miike took home the gold with 13 Assassins being my favorite of the series, and Detective Story is no 13 Assassins. Like I said, this man's made over 100 films in his career so far, and with that much output, you're bound to have some misses. And while I don't think Detective Story is a complete miss, as it does offer up some good things, there's plenty from his filmography I'd definitely recommend over this, and I'm giving this one a 5.5 out of 10. The Skycrawlers was one I actually picked up not too super long ago from the $1.25 tree. It's a film I've heard about since it's directed by Mamoru Oshii, who also directed Ghost in the Shell and Angel's Egg. So when I saw it at the Dollar Tree, I was pretty excited. The film is basically about a pilot during a war between two factions getting assigned to a new base. From there, the pilot meets other pilots and their captain. All the pilots are basically kids called Childrens. Childrens are basically people who stay young forever. You learn that the war is basically between two companies rather than two countries, but without spoiling the film, there's much more that's presented here. Honestly, this is a film that goes very deep into the philosophy of war, exploring many themes such as military indoctrination of children, PTSD and how that carries throughout time, how war strips the innocence of youth, how war affects the people around not only the soldiers but the communities around that conflict, how war is necessary to keep peace around the world, how war is a never-ending cycle, and how those in conflict can never really escape that conflict. For the children, pretty much the only release from the graps of the war is death. These themes are not easy ones to process, but are presented carefully throughout the film. The opening set piece being a thrilling dogfight in the air, silent but the roar of the planes and the screams of gunfire throws you right into the mix out of the gate. It's honestly an amazing opening sequence. And the film comes back around to almost end on the exact same style of scene, mirroring the opening, which for me cemented the whole idea that the war is a never-ending cycle. You could argue that on a second watch, that you're actually not watching the same film, but the cycle repeating, which is something I found to be rather profound. Editor's note, I'm sitting here editing footage for the Skycrawlers review when I'm cutting up the movie, and I realize, hey, there's a post-credit scene that is really important to the overall message of the story. So if you're watching this movie, definitely check out the post-credit scenes. It really cements that idea of this being a never-ending cycle, so check it out. There's honestly not a lot of action in this film, but when the action is here, it's enthralling and exhilarating. The dogfights feel almost like a ballet of death in the sky that hits hard as the bullets shear through metal and flesh, coating the cockpits in crimson red. While yes, there's downtime from these set pieces, we spend that time with the characters to get a lot of development. You truly learn what these people are like, their habits, and how much conflict has affected them. The captain clearly struggles with PTSD. Our main character Yuichi's roommate constantly drinks or spends time with women to ease his mind. Yuichi honestly walks around rather void, everything coming off as usual, almost like he never expects anything bad to happen, and he's almost innocent in nature, which allows the back end of the film, with its soft twist, I guess you could call it, to hit hard when it's revealed. In terms of the story and pacing, it's beautifully executed. However, this film has some major issues for me when it comes to some of its presentation. I'll start off with the music. I do like the music on a composition standpoint. It's music that I would honestly listen to outside of the film. However, the music feels incredibly misfitting with the film and its tone. The music almost feels like something more akin to a lighthearted medieval fantasy story rather than a dour military drama. We see the opening set piece that's brutal and gripping, and then it cuts to the credits and we get this. It's really jarring to me and doesn't seem to fit the film thematically at all. There are a few instances where the score seems to fit, but for the most part I found it constantly distracting. I also found the animation to be really inconsistent. I will say, this film looks great in the sense of cinematography. The framing, what they choose to present on screen and how it's positioned. The animation though is a blend of 2D and 3D animation, which can look great. We've seen it well done in Disney and DreamWorks movies, but I've always found that in Japanese animation, for some reason, they don't seem to blend it as well, and that's kind of the case here. Pretty much all the vehicles is 3D, including the planes, and when it's all you see on the film, it looks stunning. Again, those dogfights look absolutely amazing. The 2D animation though is honestly what I have the biggest hang up with. Yes, it does stand out like a sore thumb compared to the 3D animation, but it isn't a smooth 2D animation. The characters' movements are stiff, but the part that kept pulling me out was the facial animations, or the lack thereof. Pretty much every character sports the same facial expression for the entire movie, no matter what they're talking about or what's happening. There's a scene where Yuichi goes from his 1,000-yard stare into a smile, and the character just holds that expression long after the emotions passed. This is just an example, but the entire film is like this. I get it if you want to have more muted expressions. It fits with the theme of the film, but there's a lot of moments where the dialogue and story is expressing emotion, even through the voice actors' performances, but the animation carries none of it across. It is distracting and takes away from some of the impact of the drama when you're presenting these philosophical themes and the characters more or less just have a blank stare or stuck expressions. It's not enough to ruin it by any means, but it definitely lessens the impact. Overall though, I really did enjoy the Skycrawlers. There's a lot to chew on here, and the film does a great job at telling its story and presenting all of these different philosophical messages to make you think long after the credits roll. It has some amazing dogfights and it's definitely worth a watch, and I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. Oh boy, Spartacus, none other than Stanley Kubrick himself. I picked up the Blu-ray Steelbook edition of this a while ago at Best Buy because Kubrick is one of those directors I really admire, but honestly I haven't seen a ton of his films. What I have seen though, I've loved, and he's a very celebrated director within the community. Spartacus is one of those films that is daunting to jump into. It's easily the single longest film of the season, so far this series, clocking in at a massive 3 hours and 17 minutes. This isn't one that you're just going to kill a couple hours with, this is one you set aside time for. Winning 4 Oscars for Best Actor in a Supporting Role, Best Cinematography, Best Art Direction, and Best Costume Design, while also being nominated for Best Film Editing and Best Scoring. The film follows Spartacus, a slave who is bought by a gladiator school when a violent riot breaks out freeing the slaves. Spartacus becomes their leader, freeing the slaves as they travel to the sea to leave the country on boats. When arriving to the coast, they realize they're trapped between armies and must fight the Roman Empire head on. All while Cassius is trying to seek power within the Roman Empire by taking Spartacus down. There's a lot going on here.
Give your balls a tug, you tent fucker!
There's a lot going on here as the film is a rally cry for freedom, connecting with the characters you hope for their success, and Cassius is an easy one to hate as he's a great villain. A conniving cutthroat that only wants what he wants, and it doesn't matter how he gets it. There's actually a scene that really cemented him for me as a pretty vile villain, or at least made me question the humanity in this so-called civilized society. It's when Spartacus fights Draba for Cassius and Glabros' entertainment. While these two men are fighting to the death, Cassius and Glabros just begin talking to each other like the fight's not even happening. Like, shh, I'm trying to watch this. But in all honesty, I don't know why, but that scene really stuck out to me as one of my favorites in the film. It conveys so much of the story and sows so many seeds, from Cassius' callousness for human life to not even pay attention to those fighting for life for his entertainment, Draba's defiance furthering the fire inside of Spartacus. The story basically begins with them two and ends with them as well. Spartacus never forgetting Cassius, while Cassius can't even remember what Spartacus looks like when it comes down to it. Some of the performances are outstanding. Personally, I think Laurence Olivier as Cassius should go down as one of those greatest performances of all kind of thing. And I really enjoyed Kirk Douglas as well as Spartacus. Apparently this is the first Kirk Douglas movie I've ever seen. He's very recognizable and a household name, but according to IMDb, I haven't rated anything he's been in besides celebrity cameos. I did find John Dahl's performance as Glabrius to be very wooden compared to the rest, but everyone else here who gets some heavy screen time was outstanding. The film won the Oscar for a lot of the visual categories, and it earned it. The cinematography is amazing. I love the use of the wide angles, especially during the fight scenes, to really show you the scope of the film. Speaking quickly on the scope, this movie is kind of mind-blowing for the amount of moving pieces in some of the scenes. There's large sections where there's so many bodies on screen I can't tell if any of them are added in post or if they're just really there in person. There's still so many warm bodies though that it's beyond impressive in terms of coordination. Just the scale of the final battle alone is worth giving the film a watch. The costumes and set designs are lavish and fitting. Sure, some of the weapons look dull or fake, but they're serviceable. As for the wardrobes, they look fantastic. There's some moments where it's filmed on a stage set, and the size and design is very impressive. I always love those old stage sets, those old sound stages, love them. In terms of visuals, it's hard to believe this film is from 1960, over 60 years old now, and it looks amazing to this day. The transfer on the Blu-ray is pretty incredible. The music adds to the timeless feel as it's as large sounding as some of the set pieces in size. Weirdly enough though, this film opens on just a musical black screen, which confused me. I thought for a second maybe my Blu-ray player finally went bust, but then the film started about 3 minutes into the black screen. The film is also broken up with an intermission, so you could watch this film in 2 settings if you wanted to. I mean, you can watch any movie in any amount of settings you desire, but the film does present a nice break if you didn't want to devote a whole day to it. Honestly, if I rewatched this film, I would probably do that. Now, with everything glowing I said about the film, this isn't a perfect film in my opinion, and honestly, it's probably my least favorite I've seen from Kubrick so far. I did enjoy the film overall, but that runtime is a runtime to say the least. The film is paced really well to keep it from getting stale for me, but I wasn't as invested in it as something with a similar runtime like Seven Samurai. There's elements here that really just didn't work for me. After watching the film, I read some trivia to find out there was a lot of production issues with the film, stemming a lot from the artistic direction from Kirk Douglas with its directors, the first director being fired very early on, and then Kubrick came in. Kubrick wasn't given full creative control of the film, and according to the trivia, the two feuded so badly throughout the production that they went to therapy together and never worked together on another production, pushing Kubrick to disown this film despite it being really well received, a commercial success, and Oscar winner. This drama unfortunately bleeds over into the film. The The film, at least for me, had some major tonal issues, where you would have this nihilistic savagery, corrupt leaders getting away with discarding human life, and the overbearing weight of the desire for freedom, even if death is that freedom. But then there's like some really cheesy romance heavily sprinkled throughout the film. This cheesiness coating the ending of the film that felt like it should have been much more horrific and scarring. It's some of those scenes that left me fleeting, wanting some more serious grip to wrangle me back in. Film is always a personal experience that should be unbiased from what others say in terms of your experience. I'm saying this just because this was something that the film did that didn't work for me, and was a real distraction from what I felt like my experience with the film was crafted for. It may not come off to you that way. Overall though, there is some masterclass stuff here that definitely makes it a recommendation, but sometimes you just don't fully connect with the film, and I just didn't fully connect with this one. There's a lot here I love and did connect with, but again, there are some inconsistencies with its tone that I just didn't fully get behind. I feel like I've said this quite a few times this season, but it could go up or down on a second viewing, which I would be willing to give it a rewatch, just maybe in 2 different settings rather than 1 again. That 2 setting things might actually help me with the tonal inconsistencies, who knows. I'm glad I finally checked this one off my list, and I really need to finish out Kubrick's filmography at some point, and I'm giving this one a 7.5 out of 10.
Where the hallway comes. People were gonna arrest him and stuff.
So this year when I was putting movies in the list to be randomly selected, I decided that box sets would also be included. Each film in the set would get a number, and whichever number got picked, the full set would be included. That is, if the set was a trilogy or smaller. I mean, I'm not about to go through like a 15 movie box set or something for this series. However, the Criterion set for Police Story 1 and 2 was selected, so I finally got to watch these Jackie Chan Hong Kong classics, and I had a total blast with them. I've been interested in the Police Story movies ever since I picked up Police Story Lockdown on launch and decided not to watch it when I found out there's a whole set of Police Story movies to watch. I later found out that Lockdown isn't really a part of that series despite the title. I still haven't watched it yet, and it wasn't included in the drawing because I want to watch all the other Police Story movies first, and I don't have any of the other ones besides these 3. Even though it's not connected, I still want to see them first, if that makes sense. The first Police Story is considered one of Jackie's greatest films, which can be included with the second. When it comes to reputation, follows Jackie Chan's character Chan Kwok-wei. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. A detective involved in a sting operation to bring down a drug lord. After the lord's arrest while waiting on trial, Chan is put on bodyguard duty to protect Selena, the key witness. When Selena goes missing, the drug lord is let go and Chan is framed for murder. To clear his name and to put the lord behind bars, he must find Selena. It's a pretty solid police detective story, but what it does is really open up the waters for some crazy, ridiculous, and the best way possible stunts and action pieces. Some of the stunt work is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, the opening of a film with cars just plowing through this shanty town is pure mayhem done perfectly. The fight choreography is great and feels like it packs a punch. It's quick and fast, but also very smooth. Some actors take some major bumps that at multiple times I was going, oof, that's rough. It's this dedication to the action that really makes this film stand out. The ending set piece being another massive scene that I've seen prior to watching this film because of how iconic it is. Everything just looks so great because it's all done for real. The camera isn't shaky or close up. It's shot wide to capture everything that's happening on screen. It's not quick cutting to every hit. It shows you every real bump, and at times even putting it in slow motion to show you exactly what's going on. It's one of those films that action fans and film nerds can get behind because of the orchestra of stunts. It's wickedly impressive and methodically shown. Without a doubt, there is a lot of injuries on set, which I hate to hear. Some are showcased during the credits, which is like a loop of outtakes and the making of. This is a film that I would love to watch a true making of. This is something that wouldn't fly by today's standards, but that's partially why this film will stand the test of time. I don't want people to get hurt while making a film, however, there is nothing but appreciation for it when it comes to the end product. These people put themselves on the line to make some action set pieces that I will remember for the rest of my life. Chan is a fun character to follow, and Jackie has so much charisma that it makes him a perfect lead for a film like this. When it comes to the story though, it's a pretty standard detective get the bad guy kind of story. There's really no twists or turns throughout the film to throw you off the trail. The story again just feels like it's here more for the setup of the action pieces, but by no means is it bad either. It will keep you engaged during the cooldown moments thanks to Jackie Chan being such a great lead, and there's a lot of humor throughout the movie that kept me chuckling. This is pretty much an action comedy. comedy. There's moments where I was busting out with laughter, but for every laugh, there seemed like there might have been a punchline that fell a little flat. There's a scene in particular that I really hated where Chan is walking and steps in cow poop and starts to moonwalk basically to get the poop off his shoes. However, the courtroom scene generally had me laughing out loud. Another weak point in the story is May being Jackie's girlfriend. There's not much setup or development, and it really felt shoehorned in here. Still though, I really enjoyed a lot of the plot beats despite not being anything new. I just can't get over how amazing these action set pieces were here. The nice 80s score and sound effects were fun, but there's some serious dubbing issues here as well. Clearly there's a lot of ADR and it's very noticeable throughout most of the film. Still though, I really loved it and I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. I strongly recommend it. Now onward to Police Story 2, released in 1988, 3 years after Police Story, and again, directed and starring Jackie Chan. The sequel follows Detective Chan shortly after the events of Police Story 1. Due to the massive amount of damage caused by Chan and how the police had to pay for his lone wolf actions, he's demoted down to being a traffic cop. Shortly after, he finds out the drug lord from the first film has been released from prison due to his failing health. That anger boils inside of him to the point that he quits being a cop. One night while shopping at the mall with his girlfriend May, a bomb threat gets called in and the local cops recruit Jackie to help clear the building. With everyone out, the building does explode, leading to the cops wanting Chan to reinstate. After dropping May off at her apartment, he is confronted once again by the drug lord's lackeys, threatening revenge against him and May. However, while all this is happening, a bombing cell blackmails wealthy realtors for money to stop them from blowing up their commercial retails. Due to Chan's constant obsession with his work, he and May begin experiencing relationship issues that are exacerbated from her being in danger thanks to the retaliation. There's a lot going on in terms of the plot here, and while I think the revenge plot is really underdeveloped and leads to nowhere, the rest here is an improvement on the first. For one, there's a lot more character development for most of the cast. The film really focused on Chan, Uncle Bill, and May, adding more dimensions to their characters and really showcasing Chan's lone wolf aspect. It builds his temper more and shows us how much more willing he is to focus on his work rather than his loved ones. The relationship between May and Chan is also much more developed here, where it doesn't feel as shoehorned in. There feels like there's more history between them, and they actually feel like a couple going through some major issues, rather than the first where it just felt completely pointless. Honestly, it would have served the film better just to remove the whole revenge plot. There's enough between Chan, May, and the blackmail bombers that could have been explored more without cutting to a subplot that goes absolutely nowhere. This time around, the humor landed a lot more for me than the first. It's definitely not as comedy oriented as the first film, but I just found myself laughing at this one a lot more. Again though, the story, while for the most part is an improvement, it's really here to serve the action set pieces, which once again are amazing. There's a couple of large explosions, but there's not really as many massive set pieces quite like the first film. However, the film trades that off with having a lot more hand-to-hand combat that feels like it hits a lot harder. Again, there was multiple moments where I was cringing at some of the bumps the actors took. There's just multiple scenes that are just incredibly well done when it comes to the choreography. Again, the end credits show you a lot of the outtakes, and there's some gnarly injuries in this one for sure. But again, its showcases are some action set pieces that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Again, while the 80s score and sound effects are fun, there's a lot of really bad dubbing or ADR throughout the film. There's a character that's a deaf mute, and the ADR and the noises they make are atrocious to say the least. To me, there's some improvements to the sequel that surpasses the original, but the original presents some more iconic moments. Both films are going to be action staples for me. Without a doubt, if you're a fan of action movies, these are must-watches and easy recommendations. The transfer from Criterion looks absolutely beautiful. These are those kinds of movies though that really showcase a genre, and a type of filmmaking that both the audience and film nerds alike can admire and appreciate. If you're a fan of Jackie and you haven't watched these, drop whatever you're doing and give them a watch, and I'm giving Police Story 2 an 8 out of 10. I understand that I've praised both of these films a lot, to which an 8 out of 10 for both of them might seem a little low for how much I love these films, but they do suffer from some technical problems. But enjoyability wise, for me, they're about as perfect as they can come, and everything I would want from a detective action comedy film. I love these movies, check them out. I've been a fan of Junji Ito for quite some time now. He's one of my favorite artists, and Uzumaki is one of his most celebrated works. I didn't even know this adaptation existed until one day I was browsing half-price books and I found Uzumaki, or also known as Spiral, on DVD. Being the Junji Ito fan that I am, I snagged it even though it was a little pricey for a used DVD. Of course, just shortly after picking it up, the Blu-ray transfer would be announced. I decided to reread the original manga before going into the movie. It has been a few years since I've read it, and it's a great read that I would strongly recommend. The film version follows the same group of characters, Kiri, a schoolgirl, and her boyfriend Suichi, who live in a small Japanese mountain town that slowly at first but very quickly becomes tormented by Uzumakis or spirals. The book is broken into chapters, well duh, but those chapters act as almost standalone stories that build into something bigger just involving the same characters. In a way, the book is structured almost like an anthology with a running background narrative. The film isn't really structured this way at all. The film takes a lot of the stories and incidents from the books and compiles them into a narrative around Kiri and Suichi and their families. The story that's in the first couple of chapters of the book is kind of the main structure of the film here. Then as the story progresses, they mix in some of the other stories from the book, using those elements to bolster the horror in the narrative, rather than feeling like an anthology that focuses on the horror first and then builds the overarching narrative later. It's worth mentioning too that the film was created before Junji Ito finished Uzumaki, so the ending of the film is pretty different than the book. The book itself is a pretty massive story with some really wild moments, so I personally think, even though if the film was made after the book was finished, choosing a different direction for the film story to go in is not a bad idea. By no means where the film takes the story is bad either. It's actually not a bad ending considering the book wasn't even finished yet. I have to say I love the presentation and direction here. The film has a very unique energy and presence that complemented the source material very nicely. The way the camera moves, choices in the editing all help to add to the distortion and build its atmosphere. There's moments where distorted swirls will appear in the background, and just the way they film some of the standard dialogue scenes added to this just weird, uneasy vibe through the whole thing. I'm not sure if it's the DVD copy or not, but most of the film looks cropped. One day I'll upgrade this to Blu-ray to see if it was or not. It just didn't feel like it was the full image, but if it's the true aspect ratio, then I kind of like that, because that constant feeling like the image was cropped, where we're not getting the full picture, would kind of work well with the tone. A lot of the special effects looked really cool. Sure, some of the CG elements are dated, but considering the time, they still look pretty good. A lot of the horror designs look amazing and unique, truly capturing Ito's work on screen and staying faithful in those regards. The color grading is very dark with a lot of green overlay, which helps sell some of the effects. I figured the worst looking things would probably be the faces and the smoke and the snail people, but they were really well done, I thought, in the film, and was very striking. There were multiple moments where I thought to myself, that's really cool. My biggest hang up with the film, unfortunately, is the story. Adaptations of books, comics, or whatever should be able to stand on their own. However, I feel like with Uzumaki, the film, you should really read the book first. I'm not sure if someone who hasn't read the source material would get very much out of the film or really even understand what's going on at all. This is a quick 90-minute film that really probably should have just added another hour to its film to build its concept alone. Add in building the characters, it just didn't work in the 90-minute runtime. One of the things that works so well in the book is its pacing. Ito sets up everything slowly, so when you get to the cascading madness at the end of the book, not only is it horrifying, but you almost can't believe how bad it got, while also understanding how it got that way. It sells the horror while also building the characters very nicely. I understand this is a film. You don't have the length to fully adapt the book, but the film feels more like Cliff Notes, relying on your previous knowledge of the source material to trim out some of its world and character building. Sure, Kiri and Suichi get the most amount of attention. I don't even mind the changes to Kiri's family. They kill off the mom and never mention a brother. Most of the film follows Suichi's family, which I'm okay with too. Like I said, I like the direction they took the story considering they made up the ending, but I feel like most of my connection with the characters has to do with me reading the book first and not the film itself. Sure, the film is presenting a lot of horror really well visually, but again, it felt more like Cliff Notes rather than being fully developed. In the eyes of someone who hasn't read the source material, I'm sure the atmosphere and visual hits would work as intended, but that investment and awareness of what's really going on, as the film doesn't really try to explain the spiral, would leave them wanting more out of it narratively. There's some good bones here, and I will eventually be upgrading this to Blu-ray. As a fan of Junji Ito and the original source material, there's a lot to appreciate here, as it felt faithful and pretty well done. I just wish we had more time to help build its own structure rather than relying so hard on your previous knowledge of the source material. It works well as a companion piece for sure, but I wouldn't go into it without reading the book first, and I'm giving this one a 6 out of 10. Going into Bomb City, I always thought this was a German movie, since the Digibook Blu-ray I picked up on the clearance rack at a Half Price Books was the German release of the film, and as the film started, I was surprised it was actually an American film set in Texas, which really threw me for a loop. With that aside, Bomb City from 2017, directed by Jameson Brooks, opens up to a court case as a lawyer talks about what a punk rocker was wearing, alluding to a crime that took place. We cut to a punk rocker wearing the jacket from the court case, where there's a Marilyn Manson narration about people placing blame and questioning acts of violence, while the punk rocker ventures around Texas, intercut with a football team and a boy driving around in a Cadillac. The film is based on the true story killing of Brian Deneke, which I knew nothing about. Honestly, that's probably for the better, as the film is structured in a way that if you were previously privy to the case, then the way the film subverts expectation could really fall apart for the film. I'm going to try not to spoil the film, but it may be hard considering potentially the strongest aspect of the film is this subversion of expectation with how the film is setting up the tone at the beginning of the film compared to how the film plays out and the climax of the film. It's this shift in the subversion that I really think drives home the message of the film, that it basically boils down to not judge a book by its cover. Sure, there's a deeper meaning here about society's expectations and how society views normancy, how that society could easily look away from the facts to point blame at something that breaks the norm, as to not see how something that fits the narrative of society itself is being at fault. This is a message that I've always stood very passionately behind, as it's typically a forefront argument for artistic censorship. Sure, the film isn't trying to protect freedom of speech in that sense, but it tries to raise the question on how we as a society view its members and how we want something perfect for a scapegoat when that mundane is broken. From here on out, we follow Brian Deneke and his punk rock lot as a party go to concerts and live their lives, struggling with rent and pushing for their artistic dreams. We also cut to another storyline about Cody Cates, a young football player and an all-American kid, who him and his football teams have constant run-ins with the punks, which normally lead to a scene, but not quite an altercation. First off, the most glaring issue with the film is no one, and I mean no one who plays a teenager, which I'm assuming they're supposed to be a high school football players and not collegiate, look like teenagers. They look old as shit. That's a pet peeve of mine anyways in films, is when you try to pass off adults as teenagers in movies. Just get teenagers. Just hire teenage actors. I understand that most of the punks are supposed to be older, but if that's a high school football team, they sure don't look it. The film, I guess, never really says, but considering how the lawyer talked, I'm just going to assume they're in high school, which just kept taking me out of the experience. Another thing that I found distracting was, for the most part, the acting was either stiff or hammed up. Some of the line delivery felt like cringe as they spew what felt like forced curse words for the sake of saying fuck a bunch of times. For the most part, the cinematography was good. I liked a lot of the color grading considering how much of the film was shot at night. It doesn't look super grainy or pushed. There is a scene where the lip sync was off that did take me out of the experience.
Don't just sit there. Get up and get the lady another beer.
For the most part, one of my favorite things about the film was the music. A lot of it was solid pieces I could see myself listening to while writing or just wanting to zone out, which may sound like a weird compliment, but I did like it. Overall, the film definitely isn't bad. What really pushes it along is its sense of purpose mixed with a pretty compelling story based out of real events and some of its technical prowess. It's not perfect by any means, but I'd definitely be willing to check out whatever Jameson Brooks does next, and I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid sits upon a long list of classic westerns I haven't watched yet. I love westerns, but I just never find myself grabbing them to watch for whatever reason. This one being one of the bigger names in the genre, even nabbing 4 Oscars for Best Writing based on material not previously published, Best Cinematography, Best Original Song, and Best Original Score, while also being nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Sound. This is one I've always seen around, but I finally picked up because I believe... Where did I get this one at? I honestly can't remember where I picked it up at. Anyways, the film is directed by George Roy Hill and follows Butch Cassidy, played by Paul Newman, and the Sundance Kid, played by Robert Redford, based on the real-life old Western outlaws, robbing trains and banks until they're on the run, being chased down by bounty hunters hired to kill them and an expert tracker. The two and their love interest decide to bail to Bolivia, where their antics brings the heat back on themselves. I really enjoyed this one. First off, Paul Newman and Robert Redford have amazing chemistry together. They both give great performances that I'm honestly shocked weren't also nominated for Oscars. Both have a certain amount of charisma that really brings their characters to life. Even though they're the bad guys, very heavily sugar-coated bad guys, you can't help but root for them to pull through through. There's just something so likable about them, and it's humorous that almost every character they rob is super friendly with them even though they are being robbed. The cinematography is absolutely beautiful, capturing some amazing landscaping. There's moments at night where they cast lights and create shadows that contrast really nicely. I also love some of the soft lenses they use to add some glow to some of the scenes. I want to mention too that I really enjoyed how they presented the opening credits to be like an old silent film. I just really enjoyed it and wanted to mention it. Also, the way the film chooses to end is great. It's one of those endings I've seen before, and I knew how the film would end before seeing it because it's so iconic. One of the problems is when you get into these classic movies, especially ones that are this popular and have this much impact, it's hard not to see some spoilers of the film because it's referenced or parodied in other pop culture. Just by being a movie nerd, you come across scenes, and that's the case here. By no means did it lessen the impact or how iconic it is. Another thing I really enjoyed was the music, which isn't typical Western fanfare. There's some licensed music that complements the tone of the film, but the original score is great as well. The tone I thought was the biggest issue of the film, which is 100% personal preference, and I know that. I prefer a more gritty Western personally, or one that goes hard into the spaghetti Western genre. Butch, Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is a much lighthearted Western that borders into some comedy moments. I would have preferred a grittier take personally, as the shift between its comical nature or lightness can be off-putting in contrast with some of the darker moments and a clashing nature. The tone feels somewhat off balance for me at least. Still, even with that being said, there's some really great moments that wrap me up into the film. You do connect with Butch and Sundance, and when the odds were against them, I was invested. Another small issue I had was the gunshot sound effects. This was really only an issue in one shootout, but it's basically the same shot reused for every gunshot, and it gets somewhat annoying after a while. Still, there is something about the film that is easily rewatchable. Its quick pace and its characters and setting makes for a good story that's pretty well presented here. It's definitely one that's worth a watch, and I'll be watching it again eventually, and I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. Basket Case is one of those cult 80s movies that's always been on my watch list that I've just never gotten around to seeing. I can't remember honestly if I bought this off a buddy of mine or he gave it to me as a gift. Either way, I appreciate it. It's been in the collection for a little while now, as one I've been meaning to get around to. The film is directed and written by Frank Henenlotter and is about a young man who carries around a basket with his deformed, used to be conjoined, twin brother inside as they seek vengeance against doctors who separated them despite them wanting to stay together. The deformed brother speaks telepathically to the normalish brother, as the normalish brother, played by Kevin Van Hentenryck, hunts down the doctors but also falls for one of the doctor's receptionists. Honestly, I gotta be honest with you. I hated this film. Sorry, if you're a fan of this one, by no means don't let anything I say change the enjoyability of it for you, but I could not wait for the credits to scroll on this one. The performances are terrible across the board, like literally some of the worst performances I've ever seen, like Diana Brownie as Dr. Cutter. Just those dead eyes and that wooden delivery was painfully awful. Every line of dialogue is stiffly delivered, and some lines aren't even like laughably bad, they're just bad. The plot itself is fine, but doesn't lend itself to be overly gory or as exploitative enough to carry the bad elements. The gore effects look pretty bad, as that blood is like that candy red, non-believable blood. The basket case killing people is basically the actor being killed holding it up to their face and yelling. The brother himself isn't an awful design, but it's rather goofy than horrifying. This is one of those films that really needed to push the edge of being overly gory and violent to make up for the lack of everything else. It needed to do something more with what it had. I've seen a lot of films in this genre that have a lot of the same issues as this film does, but they lean harder into that sensationalism that helps pass along and forgives somewhat of its lacking qualities, which this film is really missing. You're setting your film in what seems to be like seedy New York, a revenge tale with an overpowered, deformed, possessive brother. There's a lot you could have done with this within its budgetary restrictions, but they just don't. It honestly feels like a bit more of a play-by-the-numbers kind of movie that really could have taken more risks. Honestly, the only thing that really caught my interest was the fact that when the brother had to move on its own without another actor in frame, they did it in stop-motion animation, which is pretty cool. It honestly could have used more of that. Speaking of the brother's constant screaming and the fact that his screaming is so much louder than the rest of the audio became incredibly annoying after a few bellows. Again, if you enjoy this film, nothing I say should matter to you. I know this has quite a cult following, enough to grant 2 more sequels that I'll probably never be watching. I'm just trying to express my opinions about the film and my response to the film, and I honestly got nothing out of it. I'm glad I finally get to cross this one off my list, but I'll probably never watch it again, and I'm giving this one a 2 out of 10. Pyewacket was actually a film I found new at a pawn shop for very cheap and originally thought about flipping it on eBay. I do some occasional flipping to help fund my movie collecting habits, but something about Pyewacket made me want to keep it and check it out, and I'm glad I did. Pyewacket from 2017 is directed by Adam McDonald and is about a girl named Leah, played by Nicole Munoz, an angsty teenager, into the occult not far after her father dies. Her mom decides to uproot them and move hours away from her school and friends, and their relationship isn't exactly the best to begin with. After a nasty fight, Leah decides to practice some black magic to get back at her mom when she summons Pyewacket, who begins to torment the household. Honestly, what surprised me the most was the character development. The film has some rich characters, and Leah's angst and frustrations make clear sense for her actions and her thinking. One which felt like a little bit of a cop-out for the plot, but mostly you could understand why the character was doing what she's doing. I also love how they built the dynamic between her and her mother, who is played by Laurie Holden. Both leads give fantastic performances that help sell their relationship. The story also does a decent job at building her friendships to help fuel that tension between her and her mom on this abrupt move. This is a fast-paced film that uses its time wisely, so when the spookiness happens, it feels earned. But honestly, it's not the bulk of the film. There's a mystery as to what's going to happen that did go a different way than I thought it would. I'll give props to the ending of this film. It's a pretty ballsy finish. Outside of that, I do like some of the subtle haunts of the film. Not really until the end does it become upfront. It really uses the mental state of its main characters to sell the horror along with some decent imagery to help further it. There's subtle moments in the background that could easily go unnoticed, and the few apparent scenes are pretty well done to be pretty effective. Now, this film is guilty of doing something I hate in most movies, which is casting adults to play children. While Nicole Munoz does look fitting as maybe a senior, the rest look more like college students. It's just a big pet peeve of mine that just always takes me out of the experience. Most of the film is thankfully just Leah and her mother, but there are scenes with her friends where I'm just like, hey, you're not a teenager. The effects are pretty well done, and the creature at the end looks great, but the cinematography is pretty basic. Nothing looks bad or poorly framed, nothing is really out of focus, and the lighting is pretty serviceable. When you do something well but not exceptional, then it becomes unnoticeable. And that's where a lot of the technical aspects lean here. From sound, editing, cinematography, and direction, it's all pretty unnoticeable. The strongest suits is the story and performances to help bring to life the characters with some well-executed moments. It's a solid, shorter horror film that I would definitely recommend checking out, and I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. Cub is a film put out by Artsploitation Films that I've had for a really long time now. A buddy of mine found this copy somewhere and picked it up for me. This would have been somewhere around the time Horsehead and Dur Samurai came out, and I really loved those films and was looking for more Artsploitation's films releases. Finally, after all these years, I'm sitting down to watch it. Cub is a Belgian film directed by Jonas Hoverts and is about a Boy Scout troop heading off for a summer trip with their 2 scoutmasters and Jasmine the cook. When the troop arrives at the campsite, they find 2 men who get into a scuffle with one of the scoutmasters, so the troop decides to head off into the woods even further, tripping an alarm. They decide to make camp for themselves when a local officer stops to talk to them, telling them about people hanging themselves in the woods. The boys are told about a monster wandering in the woods, and the main scout we follow, Sam, is convinced he saw the creature and begins to look for it, finding the so-called cub of the film. To sum this movie up, just imagine if Ari Aster directed Moonrise Kingdom with Home Alone traps. It's pretty fun is what I'm saying. For the most part, the film seems to use practical effects, but there is a scene with some like Wicker Man level fake looking bees. I do like the idea of this kill though, where the arrow pins the hornet's nest to the boy's chest and sends the bees on the attack. It's pretty gruesome despite looking really fake.
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees! Open my eyes! My eyes! Ah!
Honestly, the traps in this movie are pretty much either I love them or they're goofy as hell. There's this decoy scene with a pair of headlights attached to this like merry-go-round thing that fools one of the campers. That was pretty interesting, but then there's the goofy contraption to drop the trees on someone. Considering how heavy and serious the film was taking itself, it's hard to buy into some of the more convoluted traps. For the most part, the traps actually do most of the heavy lifting in terms of the kills of the film. There are some slasher elements here as well, but they're more as backup rather than the main show. Most of the performances are good considering most of the film is kids. I didn't really find their performances to be distracting. The main character, Sam, played by Maurice Lewinston, did a pretty great job, and I enjoy the route they took that character. Even if the ending felt a little forced, I still enjoyed it. There's one kill though that I thought the film did really well, and that was the one where someone gets stabbed in the eye. The way the scene is lit and the juicy squirt effect just made me squirm. Another thing I really enjoyed was the score. Its main theme was great, and I'd honestly listen to this one outside of the film if it's available somewhere. The cover of the film has an awesome mask design, and I like the fact that it was as dirty as possible to make it seem even more feral, but I hated the choice to basically have it constantly make wolf growls every time it's on screen. Like, there's even some times where characters don't react to it that it definitely would have been loud enough to cause a reaction, or at least in the sound mix. It's just another element that came off as a little bit unintentionally goofy to me. As for the plot itself, it does suffer from some pacing issues. The film is only 84 minutes long, and they do use some of the traps as buffer points, but when most of the scouts don't get much screen time and the characters that do get screen time don't get much development, it can leave some moments to drag on in sections. Considering some of the mayhem that happens, I would have loved to seen some more character backstory or personality from our leads, but besides Sam, none of them really do. Peter is basically a hothead and Chris is the more well-rounded leader, these being the two scoutmasters who basically get the next amount of screen time. Don't really have much of their characters other than just that. The film spends a lot of time with these characters at the camp, but they don't really do much with them. The film also seems to attempt to set up a mystery for its characters to solve at first, but as an audience, we already know the answer to the mystery, and the fact that the film basically cans the mystery early on only felt like another potential path to lead the story for growth that wasn't taken. Overall though, Cub is a pretty decent horror thriller with some solid aspects that definitely is worth a recommendation within the genre. I'll definitely be keeping an eye out on Jonas Hovert's next project because clearly there's some decent things here, and it's a solid directorial debut, and I'm giving this one a 6.5 out of 10. Lost in Translation is one of those films that I've always heard about, but just knew nothing about it other than it starring Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson. This is one I came across at a small hole-in-the-wall record store that sells movies for 4 for $12, and in the mix was Lost in Translation, so I decided to jump on it. I have to admit that even though I've heard of this movie being brought up and generally well liked in the movie circles, it was just one that never really called me to put it in. That's what she said. I didn't know anything about it, but from the Blu-ray artwork, it was just something that never really caught my eye. I mainly picked it up due to just hearing about it and its cast. The film is written and directed by Sofia Coppola and follows two stories that intersect. One side of the coin is Bill Murray's character Bob Harris's story, an aged out movie star landing in Tokyo to do a suite of Santori whiskey ads. The other is about Scarlett Johansson's character Charlotte, who is in Tokyo with her husband who is a photographer when he has an extensive stay of work in Japan. Both are staying in the same hotel and both haven't adjusted very well to the jet lag, so both find themselves at the same hotel bar until they strike up a very playful friendship. Both characters are basically loners who feel neglected or unimportant in their lives, and they find that in each other as the film follows the two bonding. Something that really helped the flow of the film is that it feels very unscripted, but somehow catches an honest look into their relationship as it blossoms, because a lot of the film felt very ad-libbed. I'm not sure how much here is ad-libbed versus scripted, but it kind of reminded me of something like Knight of Cups or Song to Song by Terrence Malick, where its spontaneous nature can create fluid poetry, but unlike those two films, Lost in Translation has more guidance that captures that feeling and pulls more of a narration out of it. There's a sense of loneliness from both characters when they don't share screen time together. When they're not together, we either follow Bob or Charlotte as they wander around Tokyo trying to find something to fill their time. Bob is in a loveless relationship whose movie career has faded out. He feels unneeded by his kids, and moments where he talks to his wife on the phone, he just feels so passionless, even during times where he's trying to find that spark with her. It comes off as artificial, and that same feeling is reciprocated back to him from his wife. Charlotte, on the other hand, feels worthless worthless with no direction in her life. Her relationship to her husband John is turning out not what it seems to be. She comes on this trip to see Tokyo and spend time with him, but he's constantly gone for work. But even when he's not on a shoot, he's either sleeping or meeting with other people about another job. There's even a time her and John run into a famous actress that John has shot before, and they connect so much more lively than her and John, leaving Charlotte to question her love for him and her place even more. This builds to a point in the film where two characters almost just look for reasons to spend time with each other so they can fill the role that they need desperately. It's almost sad when you think about it, but the film plays it off as almost like a romantic honeymoon phase every new couple goes through. As you watch the film, you're not quite sure if they'll cheat on their spouses with each other, but the way the film conveys their characters, you almost hope that they do because it's clear they're better for each other than their current situations. There's a good amount of humor thrown throughout the film, but I was never really laughing out loud, but just rather found the film to be humorous. In terms of cinematography, it was good but rather unnoticeable for the most part. The same could be said with the editing and score. Musically, there's a lot here that feels like it's from its time period, that early 2000s skater punk rock kind of thing, and that's kind of most of the licensed music when it's used. It fits the era of the film but also seems to date it somewhat, if that makes sense. These though are without a doubt standout performances from both Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson, who both just kill it here. And this is one of my favorites from Murray and definitely up there as one of my favorites from Johansson as well. This is a pretty easygoing film that you can either take at face value and get plenty out of it, or you can dig deeper into the character's actions and also get a ton out of it. It's one of those films that may not present much additional information on a second watch, but probably has enough subtle moments to get something out of that second watch, even though this film is super enjoyable and totally worth multiple watches. Because these characters are so rich and deep, just to revisit their story will be fun on its own. This is one I was just honestly surprised by how much I got caught up into it. Sure, there's some elements I wish had a bit more flair to it, but there's nothing really bad here. I love the characters and the tone of the film carried throughout, and due to its light nature despite having some heavy themes, it would be a solid pick-me-up film to add into that genre rotation, and I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10. The Day the Earth Caught Fire is put out by Kino Lorber and is one I bought off a buddy when he was selling some of his stuff. This is a film I never really heard about before, but the cover artwork really piqued my interest, and he was selling it at a good price point, so thanks my guy. The film follows Peter Stinning, a somewhat washed up alcoholic journalist, when the US and Russia exploded nuclear bombs. When days after the event, the weather and climate begin to drastically change around the globe, the newspaper puts Peter on the job to investigate the story. Along the way, he falls for a phone receptionist of a scientist. Through their relationship, she reveals a conversation she overheard about the Earth being moved on its axis by 11 degrees and changing its orbit heading toward the sun. From there, water begins to disappear and rations begin to be given out as the Earth heats up. With little time to spare, it's a desperate hope to find a solution to the problem. The film follows Peter and the news crew along with Janie, the phone receptionist's love interest, through a rather bleak and hopeless feeling narrative that ripples the caution of nuclear weaponry and climate change. I really enjoyed this one. It's pretty fast paced, and for a film out of the early 60s, some of the special effects are really cool. I really like some of the weather effects they used, and they weren't afraid to smash up some sets either. Edward Judd does a great job in the lead, but a lot of the other performances can be really stiff or overplayed. Personally, I didn't really like Janet Marino's performance as Janie, as it felt a little too overplayed. The film looks great. The cinematography is rather standard fanfare for a film of this time, but the transfer from Kino looks outstanding. There's even a couple scenes that might have been too hard to repair, and it's not as sharp and can have some heavy grain, but weirdly enough, it feels like it fits the tone of the film pretty well. I also love the choice to use different film stock once the Earth caught fire, switching from standard black and white to a sepia style stock that looked great as an aesthetic. The pacing of the film though is rock solid throughout. As the first two acts of the film, you're discovering the mystery of what's happening around the world with the main character, all while the film develops character relationships. Peter gets a lot of development as the lead. You're constantly rooting for him despite his flaws. The world and characters feel real and lived in, rather than just characters despite some lacking performances. And once you build to that final act, the film almost feels like it slows down some to prolong that inevitable. That really worked for me. The set designs look great, and I loved how wild some of the film got in regards to the looting aspect of the end times. I really wasn't expecting it. Characters almost always look hot and sweaty once the world starts to heat up, and it feels like there's some real attention to detail when it comes to the environment the film is set in. The themes of nukes destroying the world and us not doing anything about climate before it's too late is sadly still relevant over 60 years later. For some reason though, according to the IMDb trivia, the film received an X rating from the British Board of Film Censors, which I just find to be hilarious. This was one I went into with really no expectations, but really enjoyed it and definitely would recommend it, and I'm giving it a 7.5 out of 10. As a fan of martial arts films, of course Lady Snowblood would call to me when I came across it at a Criterion sale. Striking box art and a revenge story, and the set including its sequel, I'm down to clown. Just one thing to note, as with most Criterion sets featuring more than one film, you typically have each film on a separate disc, or at least from the ones I've owned, except Lady Snowblood. Both films are on one disc, not sure if that's really worth mentioning, but there it is. The first Lady Snowblood, released in 1973 and directed by Toshiya Fujita, is about a young woman who is seeking revenge. Born in a prison and raised by a trainer who made a deal with her mother after her mother dies during childbirth, she is trained to seek revenge on those who killed her mother's husband. Not her father, by the way.
You are not.
And the group that also her mother for 3 days. When the mother kills one of the four, she is sent to prison and gives birth to Yuki, aka Lady Snowblood. The rest of the film is her seeking the other three, while a writer is writing papers about her tale. It's a pretty solid revenge story that reminded me a ton of Kill Bill. Like to the point where I was thinking, damn, Tarantino just straight up copied Fujita's homework. After reading some of the trivia, Tarantino clearly states this is one of his biggest inspirations for the Kill Bill saga. I honestly didn't know that going in, and it was pretty obvious during. Apparently it also mentions that on the back of the Criterion case as well. Maybe I should start reading more than a sentence on the back of these things. As far as revenge stories go, it's nothing super unusual in its plot. That's not to say it's a bad plot either. The film will bounce between different time periods to present its story, which does keep the pacing moving nicely, and helps keep a pretty standard plot fresh. Miyuko Kaji, who plays Snowblood, is great in the lead and adds complexity to her rather ruthless revenge machine of a character. The villains are fun to watch her take down, and I like the whole idea around the Snowblood angle. There's a saying at the beginning of the film where, I'm paraphrasing, "You can't wash away the mud of this earth with pure white snow, you need stained fiery red snow." It's a pretty cool quote that presents the theme of the film really well. The film opening and closing on blood-stained snow, as her path has always been covered in blood. It's a pretty ruthless story for the most part that does have some satisfying moments. In its presentation though, it honestly reminded me more of Grindhouse style films. The music isn't typically for this genre, but it has some really awesome mixes of soft rock and what I would call karaoke music that fits really well with its bloody story. The overuse of blood where wounds would just spray out covering the area and the actors in it, mixed with some experimental camera work, can make some of the moments very frantic and interesting. Cinematography isn't perfect. There's some really shaky and uneven camera movements that look pretty bad. There's moments where tripod still shots have some weird bumps and movements that feel unintentional. And while the film does a lot of cool things through the whole film with blocking, movements, zooms, and cuts, it doesn't always work at times and can come off awkward. My least favorite thing though about the film unfortunately comes down to the action set pieces. For one, I love that the film goes as bloody as it does, and some moments can be gory and gruesome. There's some decent makeup and effects here, but when it comes down to the action choreography, it's really stiff and feels unpracticed. I can see the actors are holding back as to not make contact, and as well as Miyuko Kaji was in her performance at an emotional aspect, I didn't buy her as a super skilled swordswoman killer. She came off as very unfamiliar and uncomfortable on screen with her weapon. I love the design of her sword being in the umbrella, but just the movements aren't convincing, nor are they goofy in a way to make it funny. It's honestly not a ton of the film considering as much blood as there is. It's really only a couple of scenes, but it just felt disappointing during those scenes because I was really loving everything else. A lot of the set designs are awesome, the costumes look great, and the swords looked more realistic than something like Human Lanterns from earlier in the season. I love the snowy sections as this big puffy fake snow on a soundstage that just looks so visually appealing to me. I personally think with some better action set pieces, this could have easily been an 8 or a 9. I was enthralled with the story, but some of the moments just took me out of the film, and I just can't get behind some of the bigger set pieces, and I'm giving this one a 7 out of 10. A year later, Toshiya Fujita, along with a reprising Miyako Kaji. Lady Snowblood 2 Love Song of Vengeance was released in 1974. The film picks up pretty much right after where the first one ended, with Lady Snowblood, also known as Yuki, is on the run when she is arrested and sentenced to death by hanging for her violent actions in the first film. As she's being transported to prison, a group of secret police show up and break her out, striking a deal with her to assassinate the leader of a political uprising. The first film is set in the late 1800s during a time where Western influence was shaping the Japanese political landscape, and while the first film presented this information, it was really used to set up the world and the time of the story. It helped explain some of the villain's courses of actions, which was a small layer of information that helped expand the setting of the story nicely. In the sequel, this information is the main course of discourse in the film. The main struggle being if Lady Snowblood will assassinate the leader or join their cause when the secret police are pretty nasty people themselves. Honestly, I could be real with you, this is one of those sequels where you go, why was this made? The first film was a self-contained story that had a great character arc with a satisfying climax. This just feels like a stapled-on story that really didn't add anything to Yuki as a character. It felt pointless to bring this character back for a story like this. Sure, it may be seen as a redemption arc, but it's unnecessary in my opinion. There's definitely some improvements here though. For one, the cinematography is much better, still using some interesting frames, angles, and movements to keep in line with the style of the first film, but also feels more refined, which added to some of the frantic moments and helped push along the pretty lackluster plot. The set designs and the costumes feel more lavish here than the first. There's a couple of sets I really love the design of. It looks awesome. The action set pieces are better in this film, but still not where I think it should be in terms of being believable. Compared to the first film, the action and sword choreography feels like just picking up the sword for the first time in the first film to having about a few weeks worth of training in the second. The sequel being filled with more of these action set pieces, but also much bloodier, which can help swallow the stiff choreography. Musically, the film uses the same styles as the first, and it works really well here. Performances are good across the board, but it's just the narrative. I just couldn't get into it at all here. I was checked out and ready to wrap it up. I was thinking maybe because it's tied to Lady Snowblood, which is why I was checking out, because it felt pointless, but even if it was on its own thing, there's just not much of anything here from a narrative standpoint. The film somewhat relies on you seeing Lady Snowblood, as it doesn't build on Yuki's character at all. She doesn't get any further development in my opinion, and the plot being in the throes of basically a political war is pretty played out. The film has some interesting presentation, but where the first film was a pretty standard revenge story, it's propped up by developing a strong lead, using a non-linear structure to keep pacing going, and had some good villains to develop and watch interact with Yuki. None of that's here. It presents a pretty basic story, but doesn't reach out in any way to make it stand out like the first did. Yes, there are some improvements, but there's some big step backs as well. Honestly, I would totally rewatch Lady Snowblood, and I would recommend it as well. Love Song of Vengeance, however, I don't know if I ever really care to rewatch it, nor would I really recommend it. I would just kind of like to think that Yuki's chapter is closed after the first film, and I'm giving this one a 5 out of 10. Ikiru, or directly translated as to live, is considered to be one of Akira Kurosawa's best films. Even Kurosawa himself claims this to be his best work. That's a pretty tall order. This is one of those films I've been putting off for a long time due to what its story is about, and yeah, it's pretty great. The film is about Kanji Watanabe, played by Takashi Shimura, an elderly bureaucrat that finds out he's in late-stage stomach cancer. With given the little amount of time he has left to live, he tries to find purpose in a life he felt he has wasted. The film opens almost documentary-like, explaining to the audience what is happening before the character themselves know it, and honestly, this felt really weird and out of place for the rest of the film. However, this might be one of the most in-depth character studies I've ever seen, with Takashi Shimura giving what I would consider to be one of the greatest performances of all time. The way Shimura gives off subtle expressions, you can clearly see what's going through this man's head with no dialogue. You can feel his pain and you can bear it with him as he struggles to find something in his waning stretch of life. Every interaction with characters on screen, you can clearly see how Shimura's character feels, thinks, and reacts to what's happening. It's a brilliant performance and one of my favorite parts of the film. This is without a doubt a character study that presents a lot of heavy themes and philosophy. Watanabe is a character that spent his whole life in the bureaucratic system and really has nothing to show for it. There's a message about not letting work become your life, that a routine of the same thing can be deadly to your soul. There's another character that Watanabe worked with who's quitting, and she flat out says that if she continued working there that it would kill her. how that system is like a cancer to you. Watanabe did everything because he had to raise his son as an only dad, but when Watanabe goes to tell his son about his cancer, he overhears his son and daughter-in-law talk about getting his inheritance and how they can finally buy a house of their own, sending a message that Watanabe was so caught up in the work that he never really formed a bond with his son, even though he dedicated himself to his job for his son. He goes out with people he doesn't really know because he doesn't have any friends, and this loneliness is brought front and center when he constantly wants to spend time with the woman he used to work with who is much younger than him. She's basically the first friend he's had in who knows how long. The film presents the idea that despite how much time you have left in this world, you should spend it finding happiness, finding something that makes you, not to get caught up into the system that's unfortunately a big part of our lives. Watanabe decides to use the last bit of his life to do some good, 30 years as a bureaucrat, and he has nothing to show for it, but when a village is complaining about a cesspool they want turned into a park for the kids to have a safe space, he uses this to finally do something with his 30-year career and the last stretch of his life. Honestly, this is such a fascinating story on confronting morality. To me, the film starts off as almost a horror film. I'm somewhat of a hypochondriac, and I'm not gonna lie, but the pain and suffering caused by cancer is something that is genuinely terrifying to me, and a lot of other people too. The prospect of facing your mortality and having a timer ticking down is psychological turmoil that really gets to me. But where the film starts off this way, it almost goes through the 7 stages of grief to where the end of the film is almost cheerful in a way. The first half of the film being the diagnosis and coming to terms with that. I'm not sure if this is really a spoiler, but I'm throwing out a spoiler warning for this small section. I'm not going to really spoil too much, but I need to talk about it as it's a big positive for me with the story structure. The last half of the film actually being cut between Watanabe's funeral and the last few days of his life, with the people around him piecing together the clues because they didn't know he was sick. Personally, I was getting to the point where the first part of the film felt like, alright, it should be coming to an end. It was starting to drag on a bit, and felt like it had presented its themes and messages to their extent. Then abruptly we cut to Watanabe's funeral, and from there the structure completely changes, becoming somewhat non-linear that really helped the pacing of the film, but also felt like it brought its themes around full circle to further the impact of the message. The film has some beautiful cinematography despite some of the scenes looking damaged. The Criterion release looks good, but you can tell some of the original elements are probably damaged, but there's some amazing framing and blocking. You could just pluck frames out of this film and easily hang them up on your wall. There's little music to the film that feels more fitting for the tone, especially considering the fact that Watanabe sings a couple of songs himself throughout the film that really added to the impact when he does sing them. There's really not much negative to say about this film, other than just maybe how dense of a film it is and how heavy the material here is. It's one of those films that it takes a long time for it to sink in, but can also be rewarding on multiple viewings. If you're looking for a non-samurai Kurosawa film, this is one I would super recommend, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10.
Get out of here.
Nope.
You have like all the good weapons. I have like none of them.
I want all the good weapons.
You know what? I'll fail us again.
So do it. Give the people what they came here to see. Oh,
I did.
You hit me.
That's
We're
what
not
you
done
get.
yet either.
Insectula is a movie I only found out about because it was on the bar of deals on Blu-ray.com. Otherwise, I never would have known about it. After looking it up, it looked corny and fun, and because it was on sale and cheap, I decided to grab it. The film is a parody or homage to old 50s sci-fi monster movies where a mosquito-type monster comes to Earth and starts killing people, killing the loved one of Dell, who is a government agent who wants revenge on the creature, all while an evil doctor who looks like a discounted Werner Herzog is wanting to help the creature cleanse the Earth. And I'm not gonna lie, but I hated this movie. It was so bad. I wanted to really like it. It seemed so fun, but it's so long for what it is. Sure, it plays into the bad low budgetness and has some self-awareness to it. The CGI for one looks like Beast Wars level animation, which is fun. The film isn't afraid to showcase the awful CGI either. There's a ton of bad makeup like Dell's mustache, which in some scenes looks like it's about to fall off. But where this charm is fun at first, it loses its welcome as the film meanders through a very disjointed story. We spend a large section of the film with characters who are only here to die, and it's not fun. Like, there's so much fat and so many scenes that you could just easily remove from the film altogether, and you'd probably be left with a more enjoyable 30-minute short, where its charm would have helped carry you through to the end. But bloating this thing to an hour and 41 minutes is almost torturous to sit through. All the acting is terrible, the camera work and sound design is bad, and the film spams stock music throughout pretty much the whole runtime where it just becomes irritating after a while. The story peters out to a somewhat unsatisfying end, and the evil doctor part just goes on for so long. Like, come on, just show us the monster. There was one moment though I actually thought was kind of gruesome and a cool idea. It's where this one girl is strung up in this like bio goop restraint. I don't know how to describe it, but it was actually pretty gnarly looking. There was also some fun ideas at the beginning of the film that was kind of trippy, but it feels like one of those movies where it just shows you all the tricks in its bag within the first couple scenes and leaves nothing new for the rest of the film. What started off as something that seemed interesting quickly turned into one of those films. I honestly became so bored throughout this one I just started thumbing around on my phone trying to get to the end of this one. I don't really have much to say about this one, but if it sounds interesting to you, then give it a shot. Who knows, you may like it, but for me, I'll probably never watch it again, and I'm giving it a 2 out of 10. The Maltese Falcon is considered one of the greatest crime noir films and one of the best films ever made. Released in 1941, starring Humphrey Bogart and directed by John Huston, I've always been curious about it due to its acclaim. I picked it up on Blu-ray at Barnes & Noble during a Criterion sale. I know this isn't a Criterion, but they had it on sale for 30% off, and I went ahead and grabbed it. Movies from this era are something that I'm rarely in the mood for, so it sat on the shelf for quite a while until now. The film follows Sam Spade, played by Humphrey Bogart, who is a private eye in San Francisco when a woman comes to see him claiming she's trying to find her sister. After meeting with the woman, his partner and a guy named Thursby wind up dead. From there, mysterious armed men show up looking for the Maltese Falcon, a priceless artifact. While dealing with all of this, some of the police suspect Spade of killing his partner and Thursby, or at least has something to do with it. As the story unfolds, the mystery and guessing game didn't really work for me, as the film felt pretty predictable, and even when the film comes to the whodunit mystery wrap-up, it was really unsatisfying to say the least. I feel like I'm going to be treading water with this one, because I know what status this film carries, but I have to be honest, as I just couldn't get into this one at all. I constantly found myself distracted, wanting to look at my phone, fidget with something, and my mind kept wandering to different things as the film just did nothing for me personally. Like I said, the mystery was pretty predictable and the ending left me frustrated as it didn't feel like much of a payoff. There's something about movies from this time period where they're either a home run for me or I just don't care about them. It's hard for me to get into some of the performances from this era. There's a stereotype about these films when it comes to the acting where all the men deliver lines like this.
Now you're gonna listen to me? You're gonna listen to me good.
That was terrible!
Horrendous!
I'm offended!
I'm appalled!
And all the women put on the damsel in distress act, and that's every performance here. Humphrey Bogart was okay, but it wouldn't go into my list of greatest performances I've ever seen, and that pretty much sums up the rest of the cast as well. The pacing and films from this era are all a bit stiff, especially compared to today's standards, and that's the case here. I understand when looking at a film you almost always need to take into the account of the time period they're made in, and I try to as well. By stiff, I mean the way the film is shot and edited affects the pacing more than the story itself. A lot of the films from the era shoot the dialogue with a master, and then just a couple shot reverse shots as the characters spew exposition, and edited to just cut back and forth whenever someone is done talking. It's not presenting this exposition in an interesting way, which might be in part why I kept wandering. The story itself, its characters and mystery wasn't enough on its own to intrigue me. The cinematography is decent for the most part, but again it's very formulaic. I think of something like Psycho when I thought about writing this. I could understand why it had such an impact for its time. I'm taking that into consideration. This is from 1941, so it's very early on in film's history. But as someone who came along much later in the timeline and having seen more recent films taken themes and ideas of this film and have done it better, it just doesn't feel like it aged very well. The film really centers around the Maltese Falcon being a symbol of greed and the willingness to do anything for that folly. I can see the impact this film has had on cinema, and I understand why people would love this movie. I'd be willing to give it another chance in the future, but I just didn't personally connect with the film at all. There just wasn't anything here that was presented particularly interesting for me. If this is one of your favorite films and you're offended by me not liking it, don't be. I'm just some dumb guy on the internet, narcissistically sharing my opinions and experiences. I hope I was able to express why this film didn't land for me, enough to justify my rating of a 5 out of 10. Mystery Train is a film from 1989 written and directed by Jim Jarmusch, and I picked up the Criterion Blu-ray a few years ago from a used movie store that unfortunately is gone nowadays. Rest in peace, physical media stores. Jim Jarmusch is a director that I really admire, and I've seen about half of his filmography at this point, and there's always something to appreciate in his films, Mystery Train being no different. The film is basically about 3 different stories set in Nashville, Tennessee, that all somewhat intersect at the end, each of the stories being marked with a chapter title. The first story is about a Japanese couple who are fans of the Nashville music scene who come to the city on a train to tour Sun Records. After their touristy day, they head back to a cheap motel to stay the night. When we jump into the second story about a woman who meets a creepy guy and basically tells him to buzz off. Coming out of the diner, she notices him and another guy with him as they start to confront her. She takes off running from them and ends up at the cheap motel as well, the same one that the Japanese couple are at, and there she meets Dee Dee, a woman with no money trying to get a room. The two end up sharing a room when one woman sees the spirit of Elvis. It's a running gag throughout the movie that Elvis is literally everywhere in the movie. He's constantly in pictures or paintings, and most of the cast is somewhat sick of Elvis, but the one woman who sees the spirit is actually like a huge fan. It's a pretty funny running gag as the film goes on. The third story is about a man who people nicknamed Elvis. He and a friend are getting drunk at a bar since this Elvis's woman left him. After waving around a gun, the one friend calls another friend to come pick him up. The new friend, along with Elvis's brother-in-law, played by Steve Buscemi, of all people, pick him up and head to the liquor store. There, Elvis shoots the clerk, and the trio run off to hide at the cheap motel. This really should have been called like Mystery Motel rather than Mystery Train. There's barely a train in the movie. Joking aside, there's a lot to appreciate here. The film is shot nicely, the performances are great, and the film is filled with Jarmusch's dry humor. If you haven't seen a Jim Jarmusch film before, honestly, this wouldn't be a bad entry to get into his style and career. A lot of Jarmusch-isms, that's a weird word, Jarmusch-isms, can be found throughout. His rock and roll style is steeped into his character designs and their actions. The story being centered around Nashville feels very Jarmusch-y, and Jarmusch has an almost somewhat slower nature to his films. Characters aren't exactly fast moving or fast talking, but this stilted movement helps convey that dry tone of humor. And when I mean dry sense humor, I mean like desert dry. Which for me is something I love, and I constantly find his films to be humorous or even at times hilarious, but I can see where his style of humor might not be for everyone. One scene that had me laughing was when the Japanese couple give the bellhop a plum. Later, talking to his boss tells him not to eat it and then just out of nowhere eats it in one bite. They also call back to this joke where at random the boss just asks for another one.
Say, do you have any more of those Japanese plums? Or any other exotic fruits? You ate my only plum, remember? Yeah.
The whole Elvis is everywhere gag I also found to be really funny as the film just kept bringing it up over and over and over and over and over and over again. I do have some issues with this film though. For one, the audio is pretty bad. There were moments where I felt like you couldn't hear what the actors were saying at all. There's some noticeable noise grain and some moments where the Foley sounded too sharp, if that makes any sense. My biggest issue with the film is just the structure of the film as a whole. This could almost be considered an anthology film. One of the biggest selling points with me with anthology films is the larger pool of talent that's put together to make the film. Different ideas that may or may not combine into a larger narrative, but having that different pool of talents and styles is usually what makes them interesting. Interesting or not though, the structure of anthologies where you go from one story to another has always felt to me way longer than it actually is, because I've always found anthologies to have a somewhat disjointed pacing. You're constantly breaking up the flow of the film to present new themes and characters and story in a way that always feels like the first part of a movie. So with every storyline progressing, you kind of reset the story for the new entry. This making the pacing to me feeling much longer than it actually is. This is just something that gets to me anytime I watch a film that has a structure like this, no matter how enjoyable it is. By no means did it ruin the film, but it is something for me to take into consideration when rating a film. With Mystery Train having a similar structure where it's basically 3 short films that intertwine at the end, it has that feeling of starting over at points that did make the runtime feel longer, even though I was really enjoying the film. This is something that may be fixed on another viewing, and I would definitely watch this again. Also, I didn't notice until writing this, but the night clerk boss is played by Screamin' Jay Hawkins, which I think is pretty cool.
I will follow you.
Overall though, this is a pretty enjoyable, easygoing film with a lot of style and a great sense of dry humor that I would definitely recommend if it sounds interesting to you. It would be a great starting point if you're wanting to get into more of Jim Jarmusch's films, even if this one's not necessarily my favorite from him. It's still a pretty good film that I'm giving an 8 out of 10 to. Ode to Nothing is a film with such striking box art and a slipcase that when I placed my first order from Vinegar Syndrome, I knew, along with its premise, that this is one I really wanted to see. Ode to Nothing is a Filipino film from 2018 written and directed by Diwain Baltazar about a middle-aged woman who works in her family's embalming and funeral business. She's a very lonely and sad woman just moving through life. Behind on her bills and her land title, she struggles as she escapes to a song recorded on cassette. One day, some strange people show up with a dead woman and pay her to keep quiet. Sonia, our main character played by Pyewacket, begins to form a very bizarre relationship with the corpse. This is without a doubt a very somber and sad film. Sonia is a hard character to watch because her extreme loneliness and longing, fueled with awkwardness and self-destructive behavior, weighs you down. From interactions with the Tahoe salesman, who she crushes on despite him being what looks like half of her age, to her growing closeness with the decaying corpse, that felt like a representation that over time her relationships decay. It parallels what felt like her destructive nature. She yearns so much for this closeness that she makes it up with a corpse, believing the corpse is helping her business and showing her the way to open up and be successful. But she's also blaming her own shortcomings on the corpse as well, even turning aggressive and violent with it at times. Sonia is a very mentally disturbed and lonely person who only has her father in her life, who unfortunately acts as an enabler. This coming together full force towards the end with a debt collector. No spoilers, but it's a brutally sad climax that sure is a downer. Some movies fall into this category of being oppressively sad or unsettling to where it's not fun to watch. This borders that line for sure, as I didn't have much of a good time here. However, thanks to its rich characters and strong performance by Pyewacket, I was completely captivated until the end credits. The patience in the cinematography to leave the camera still and to let shots linger fills the air with atmosphere that carries the tone of the film until the end, with constantly smooth pacing. Beautifully framed with some pleasing and fitting color grading, it's a beautiful film to look at despite a lot of dead corpses on the screen. The score is absent from the film, besides the reoccurring tape, which makes it more impactful when that music is played. From her dealings with the families of the deceased to her comfortability with the corpse makes for some really cringe-inducing moments that are intentional but nonetheless hard to watch. Sure, moments with the corpse can feel a little goofy at times, but its absurdity can add to the tone and add to Sonia's character. Personally, I really enjoyed the film as a whole and think it's really well made with some great direction. I definitely want to check out more from Diwain Baltazar's other films. This is one though that I would definitely recommend with a bit of an asterisk because due to its slow somber nature, plus its heavy dour tone, it's hard to sell it to someone. Even though I really enjoyed the film, I doubt some people I know would, and I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10. Finally, here at last, the last entry for this year's 31 for 31, and we're ending with yet another Akira Kurosawa. Actually, a double pack this time, of Yojimbo and Sanjuro. Looking back, I think all the double features were Criterion releases, weirdly enough. Yojimbo and Sanjuro are both films I've wanted to see for a long time, this set being from one of the first Barnes & Noble Criterion sales I've ever been to, but for whatever reason I just never watched them. Yojimbo, being a film I've heard a lot about, is a story about a lone Ronin coming into town when the innkeeper asks him for help since the town is divided by two ruthless gangs. The Ronin strikes up a deal, then begins to pit the two gangs against themselves by offering his service to the highest bidder. That leads to a conflict that ends up falling apart when an inspector is coming by. After that, one of the gang leader's sons return with a revolver, and the war continues until the Lone Ronin's plan has been found out. From here, he must try to defeat the gun-wielding madman and set the town free. The Lone Ronin Sanjuro being played by Toshiro Mifune. Mifune and Kurosawa has collaborated a ton throughout each other's careers, in kind of a similar fashion as to like Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro, where you know if these two are doing something together, you're probably getting into something great, and that's exactly what happens here. Yojimbo is a ton of fun with some amazing filmmaking. The story is fun and fits the Western storytelling vibe with common motifs, but instead of being a Western with cowboys, it's samurais, which is arguably cooler. There's a lot of twists and turns from the double agent plan of Sanjuro, which can lead to some really fun and funny moments. I was honestly surprised by how humorous this film was, while also being able to contrast that well with a dark and gritty backbone. The film looks beautiful as to expect with Kurosawa. The film uses some pretty contrasting black and white that makes for some really striking moments. The fight choreography is fun and fast, the costumes look amazing, and the score is great as well. There's very little to complain about overall. Really though, this isn't a very action-packed film, but the dialogue and the conniving nature of most of the characters just set up for some really enthralling pieces. Considering how fleshed out the characters are as well, it's easy to get wrapped up into the film's world. Mifune as Sanjuro is great as he nails the character perfectly. Mifune's demeanor just fits that wandering but cunning samurai who's a real threat both physically and mentally. The structures of the gangs are set up nicely so you understand how they work and their motives. It's a film so expertly crafted and paced that the next thing you know, boom, the credits are rolling. It's easy to understand after finally watching the film just how many films have been inspired by Yojimbo. However, I don't think any's done it really as well as Yojimbo. This is probably the easiest film to recommend to people who are wanting to get into the samurai genre, classic Japanese cinema, or Akira Kurosawa, as it's both expertly crafted and wickedly entertaining. It's one of those films that could easily become a 10 out of 10 in the future with another watch or two, but currently I'm thinking about like a 9.5 out of 10. The other film in the set is Sanjuro, a somewhat sequel to Yojimbo, released in 1962, also directed by Kurosawa and also starring and reprising Toshiro Mifune as Sanjuro. This time around, Sanjuro wanders himself right into the middle of a political tiff when Masuda the Chamberlain is kidnapped. The one clan superintendent tries to get Masuda to write a confession that he's corrupt so the superintendent can take control of his clan. Sanjuro decides to help the rebels and try to free the Chamberlain and his family by devising a plot to outthink the superintendent and his clan. Honestly, this is just basically Yojimbo again, following the same plot beats and barely changing the story enough not to be completely recycled. Maybe it's because I watched these films back to back, but I just found myself rather disappointed and somewhat bored with Sanjuro since the film wasn't really doing anything new here. Sure, there's a lot to love for sure. The cinematography is beautiful, the score is great, the costumes look stunning, the fight choreography is solid, the performances are good. Mifune is the perfect choice for this role again. There's also a standout scene at the end of the film where Sanjuro has a duel with one of the henchmen of the superintendents. That will probably always stick with me. But this is just basically the same thing as Yojimbo, minus a lot of the fun characters and a better setup. Sanjuro is a Mad Max-esque type of character, a lone ronin who wanders from town to town and helping people along the way. It sets up for you to do pretty much anything with him, so for the film to feel like a recycled version of Yojimbo left a lot to be desired. Somehow this film is about 20 minutes shorter than Yojimbo, but it feels about 30 minutes longer because of this. The film never towed the lines of comedy and drama, but feels a bit more flat in its tonal complexion to be a more forward action thriller. The bumbling idiots that Sanjuro is trying to help always gets in the way, which felt like it somewhat tried to be played up for laughs, but just didn't succeed. Some of the characters are annoyingly stupid as well, especially when they rescue the Chamberlain's wife, whose naivety gets frustrating at some points. There is some nice inner conflicts with Sanjuro, who at this point is just tired of the bloodshed. He doesn't want to kill anybody, but he's constantly forced to, which does make that ending scene much more impactful. There is a lot of cool things like that presented here. I liked the idea of the political conflict and the struggle of power. I love how Sanjuro plays these mind games, but again, when the film feels like it just hits every plot beat the same way as Yojimbo did, and I watched these back to back, I just wanted something more. Maybe after a while I'll come back to Sanjuro on its own and it'll strike a better chord with me. I feel like I've been kind of hard on this film, but by no means is this a bad film either. On the contrary, it's actually a pretty great film. It has a lot of Kurosawa's trappings that make him one of the best in my opinion, and one of my personal favorites. My rating could definitely go up on a second viewing, but for now I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. But we did it. We finished 31 for 31. All 31 movies, 31 days. This was an arduous task, but I think we covered a lot of really cool movies that I'm actually really happy to finally have scratched off my watch list. Much like last year, I'm going to do my top 5 favorite movies that I covered this year. So let's prepare for my top 5. Number 5, Ode to Nothing. Number 4, Police Story 1 and 2. I know I'm cheating a little bit there, but Police Story 1 and 2. Number 3, Leviathan from 2014. Number 2, one of the biggest surprises, Lost in Translation. I just had a lot of fun with that one. But our number 1 is a complete cop-out. It's a complete cheat. But the films of Akira Kurosawa, Ikiru, Ron, and Yojimbo. We covered 4 Akira Kurosawa films this year. The RNG Gods really shined heavily on Kurosawa, which I'm actually really happy with. He's one of my favorite directors, and I'm glad to just cross off more of his films off my watch list. But there's no denying that Yojimbo is probably my favorite of the 4 we watched of his. Sorry, Sanjuro, maybe some other time you'll get on my top 5. As much as I love Yojimbo, there's no denying that Ikiru and Ron aren't awesome films as well, but I just didn't want my entire top 5 to be nothing but Akira Kurosawa, pretty much. But that is 31 for 31 of 2022. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making this series. This is one of my favorite series that I do every year. I'm going to try to make it a yearly staple. It's just a lot of fun, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you next time. Take it easy. Peace.